listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition and another week of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we call America and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the Independent Corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together that means you're almost certainly listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning, everybody. It is another week. It's September 27th, just past 7 a.m. Eastern. And it is now time for our first batch of headlines this morning. Let's go into COVID stats. We have about 34,000 new COVID cases reported yesterday in the United States, also 281 new deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 120,000 cases per day. That's a decrease of 18% from the average taken 2 weeks earlier. 55% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. 64% of residents have received at least one dose. Those numbers have been idle for a while now. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 42,900,000 people across the United States, and it's killed 688,157 people here in the U.S. In national news, under the Trump administration, the CIA floated kidnapping and or killing Julian Assange while he was being housed in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Yahoo News reports that the actions being considered were part of a larger plan to surveil Assange and WikiLeaks associates, sow discord, quote-unquote, within the organization, and steal their electronic devices. The report is that the CIA's leadership, including Mike Pompeo, sought revenge for the release of Vault 7, a major release by WikiLeaks of hacking tools used by the CIA. The release led Pompeo to publicly classify WikiLeaks as a quote-unquote non-state hostile intelligence service, end quote. That's a designation which significantly broadened the scope of what would be considered a reasonable response. If I'm being honest with you, Jamarl, this story wasn't that surprising when it came out yesterday, but in its own way, it's extremely worth shouting to the hilltops, shouting everywhere, from here to non. This is the kind of thing the CIA wanted to do with WikiLeaks.
Yeah, pretty much.
Basically, journalists, as they cover it, as they should be covering it at least, they're going to give various takes on that, which is a kind of, I don't know, it gives you an increased sense of where journalists stand on some things, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I don't know. I think Julian Assange is so, at least from the standpoint of our media, intimately linked to Donald Trump, that they are warped in regards to the way they look at him. And they don't even understand, at least they don't seem to understand, that if Assange is fair game, so are they. Meaning, it's there, but go the grace of God, go I, in a sense. And if they're going to be okay with the government going after Assange, they're also fair game. The guy's just a publisher, not a publisher, a journalist.
But Trump and Pompeo were planning the assassination here. This is the thing. They were working together on it. And I'm not even seriously disagreeing with you, because I agree that the liberal media back in 2016, when Trump was approving of Assange, when it was politically convenient for him, and he was playing Assange up slightly, the very slightest bit, of course, after Assange had leaked all of Hillary's emails, basically,
right,
from that big old tranche, whatever. Trump was marginally more pro-Assange then, but then, of course, he becomes president. The left media manages to paint Assange as a kind of Trumpist figure. Oh, he's for political nationalism or whatever. He's against the empire, so he must be with Trump. But then this is, Pompeo planning this. To be clear, this is under Trump. Mm-hmm. Former CIA director, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, which is just it's a little bit gnarly, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it basically, top levels of the White House is trying to murder a journalist.
Yes.
In real terms.
Yes, exactly. And again, we'll come back to this throughout the show with a couple of guests, but worth stating clearly, this is like the biggest news of the weekend in what I would consider my sphere, whatever. Anyway, carrying on with headlines. The recent salmonella outbreak in America has reached 279 reported cases, also 8 hospitalizations. Cases have stretched across 29 different states. Samples from restaurants in hotspot areas have detected salmonella in a condiment cup containing onion, cilantro, and lime. It is impossible to tell which of these foods were tainted with the bacteria. The FBI is opening an investigation into officers involved in a suspect's takedown. That's after a police dog was allowed to bite the suspect repeatedly. Officers in Woodson Terrace, Montana, were called when a man had broken into a business. He was confronted. He appeared to be on drugs, and he threatened officers after he was warned that a dog was released. Cell phone footage shows the canine handler allowing the dog to bite the man for about 30 seconds. The man attempted to get up, stumbled. The dog engaged the other leg for another 30 seconds. Woodson Terrace is fully cooperating with the federal probe. In international news, in yesterday's German elections, the center-left party SDP has won a narrow victory, taking just under 26% of the vote. It was like 25.8% of the vote. Meanwhile, the CDU-CSU branch, which is Merkel's party, the party of Merkel, who's, of course, leaving as chancellor while this whole election process goes on after its, whatever its conclusion. Her party, a little bit less than 25% of the vote. This comes after the last week and a half where there was a massive shakeup in terms of who is leading. Mm-hmm. We're talking about this with Michelle, actually. Peter had come on. Peter Oliver, our normal guest, we'll be talking to this week, I'm sure. Normal guest talking about the German elections. When we spoke with him at the beginning of the week, this change-up had not happened. The CDU and the CSU and the Greens were all having some trouble, but they were doing okay. Then the SDP had kind of come out of, nowhere, basically. When we spoke with Michelle Whitty on Friday, she had just arrived. We'll be talking with her a little bit later this morning after this stuff is rolled out. The thing is, it's going to take months for this to settle out, for them to come up with a coalition government based on their fractured political system. Any brief comments on this, Jamarl?
Well, yeah. I mean, who's going to replace Merkel? Yeah. And what influence is that person going to have? For that matter, what's Germany after Merkel? I mean, Merkel has been there for, 16 years, and I would imagine anybody that's going to take power at this point, there's going to be some level of a demarcation point between what Merkel was versus what's going to come after. And at this point, I don't think anybody knows, So.
It's true. That is the big question, and comes at an interesting time for Europe in general. It's a strange time for Germany to have an interregnum right now, with France surging in its own way. Yeah. Although not exactly being accepted by the rest of Europe, as from private conversations we've had, particularly. Culturally kind of standing out. Anyway, we'll be coming back to that later on in the show, certainly. The U.S. is calling on Iran to allow American watchdogs to access a workshop at the Tisa Karaj complex and reinstall cameras as agreed. If they fail to do so, the U.S. stated they will consult with other board members of the International Atomic Energy Agency and respond appropriately, whatever that means for the U.S. The Taliban have petitioned the rest of the world to resume international flights in and out of Afghanistan. This comes as the vast majority of foreigners left the country during the Taliban takeover, and shopkeepers cannot move their products. The Taliban seems to be inviting the rest of the world to treat and trade with them as they would any other country. And in business news, Facebook is rebutting a report put out by the Wall Street Journal claiming that Instagram was a quote-unquote toxic app for the company. This comes after last week, Facebook's CTO resigned. That comes just a few days after Mark Zuckerberg was taking heavy flack inside the company and outside the company for promoting Facebook to users of Facebook via Facebook's own newsfeed service, a push that Zuckerberg had long resisted, apparently, in so many words, and then at some point succumbed to. Yeah. Let's play our company up to our own audience using news articles. That just sounds a little bit internally propagandistic. Anyway, those were headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, Jamarl, I went through those headlines. What are you thinking?
So we can talk about the WikiLeaks thing a little bit later because we have Misty Winston and we have John Kiriakou. And John should be good for this. I mean, considering it's the CIA that was basically taking the lead and trying to off him. But let me see. One of the other stories that you hit upon, where is it? Salmonella, no, that's not it. FBI is opening investigation into offices. Want to take? Well, that's not exactly that story. I wanted to get into the FBI story, informants. So over the weekend, the story was released that there were basically several informants for January 6th. I think it was at least 3. There might have been more. And that the FBI was basically getting real-time data and information on what was taking place on the ground as it was happening. Now, there are certain problems with this, right? Like one of the main problems is that the prosecution is trying to run a case as if it's a mass conspiracy, as if like the group itself had planned and plotted. It's like, here's your walkie-talkie, here's your duct tape, here's your zip ties, let's go raid the Capitol. And based on what the FBI, at the very least, what the informants were telling the FBI, that wasn't really the case. I mean, yes, they wanted to create confusion. Yes, they wanted to create chaos, havoc, all that stuff. Totally. But from the standpoint of whether or not they planned to basically raid the Capitol, based on what's being released, it doesn't seem like that was what was going on. In fact, it seems like what the FBI released is hurting their case or hurting the case of the prosecution trying to make this argument about a large conspiracy. What it seems like is that Trump had got a bunch of people revved up, and when an opportunity presented itself, one person, this kind of mob mentality, they went with it. It was like, oh, people are going in. I'm going in. From the standpoint of the fighting cops and everything else, you can make a case of the confusion and everything else that was taking place, especially when the cops didn't have any guns. Who knows? But what it seems like, it was a mob frenzy, and that mob frenzy took one step after the next in this kind of opportunistic fashion to raid the Capitol. It doesn't necessarily seem, again, at least by the information that's being presented, that it was planned. And on the other point for that, I mean, there's a question about how much did the FBI know and when did the FBI know it? And if the prosecution is going to make this argument that these guys planned it, and then you find out there were informants that were in the FBI, several informants, then you have somewhat of a problem. You can't really have it both ways. You can't say, yes, we had informants. Yes, we were paying attention. Yes, they were planning this, but no, we didn't do anything about it. You can't have it both ways. And so based on the Times article, and it was a good read. It wasn't, all that long, but it was a really good read. It doesn't seem all that planned.
Yes. Well,
So-
and also, okay, so a couple of things here. For one thing, you said that they came in wanting like chaos and havoc. And on the one hand, that's definitely what they got. But on the other hand, I didn't see that. I didn't see them saying that, to be clear.
It's in the article.
I-
They didn't use the term explicitly, chaos and havoc. I'm using my own term to paraphrase.
Yeah.
But they did say they wanted to get normies something. I need to pull the article up.
I
But
bet they would want to get them riled up.
yeah, something like that to
yes.
that effect. Yeah.
Yes. I hear you. I guess part
Even
of
the
it is,
term normies is funny.
well, it is. And there's a place for it, I guess, but it's also a little bit cringy, in my opinion, at this point. But whatever. Your view of January 6th is going to inflect how you view anybody's motivations going into it. If they, okay, so here's the big news. FBI had informants in the Proud Boys, not just in the membership of the top brass, which we already knew,
The
but
main guy.
in the rank and file. Enrique Tarrio,
Mhm.
the head of the Proud Boys, and former FBI informant, maybe current FBI informant. Anyway, just call him an FBI informant. If it had been planned from the top down, that would, I think, make this an FBI thing, right?
Yeah.
Because he was literally this is where it comes down to it, either former or current while that was all going on, FBI informant. But it doesn't seem to be the case that this was planned.
Yeah.
Which then, this is where the motivations of the people going into it does become kind of relevant. What is, I put it as riling up.
Mhm.
You put it as like showing, chaos
Discord,
or havoc,
chaos
that
or
kind of
havoc,
thing, sowing discord. There's like a gradient of acceptability from sort of one end to the other, I would think, right? Because on the one hand, say they think they're going into this as a protest.
Yeah.
Every protest, in some sense, is about agitating in public to make people aware of something. And
Correct.
whether you put that as riling normies up or sowing chaos and discord,
Yeah.
those are all permissible in the context of a protest. It is when, of course, a protest
literally a
crosses
protest.
the line
Yeah.
into being violent and a breach of a federal building that's not just injurious to the federal building, but to the processes therein, and therefore, in some sense, to the underlying machinery of our government. That's where it gets kind of out of beyond the pale or whatever, outside
Yeah.
of our realm of comfortability. You get my point.
Yeah, but the protest in and of itself, it's just kind of is what it is.
Yeah.
It's just the entire point.
That's the whole point of a protest,
Yeah.
is to rile people up.
Yeah.
Kind of.
And look, it only really took a small percentage of people to get the other percentage to kind of go along with. And the moment that it goes out of control, well, it goes out of control. And so, I mean, the only other way this works, I suppose, is if the monitors or the people, the informants, were misdirecting the FBI, which I suppose is possible, but this feels like a long shot. Where, it's like, okay, they're looking at us, we've planned this out, but we're going to give them bad data as we move through this. I don't know. It didn't seem to come across that way. The informant thing is interesting on a few points, though. Going back for God knows how long, in all sorts of groups that are considered anti-government groups or groups that are in opposition to the government, there's always this attempt by intel services to get in plants, to get in informants, and in some cases, rebel rousers, people who would push something forward in order to get much more scrutiny on an organization. Think of Black Panthers, for example. Yeah. Think of, what was the other party? I can't think of the name of the group. But things like COINTELPRO, or even when you see them out here, like you would see police protests, and then there's invariably some guy that does something that sparks a crowd.
Antifa is the thing you're reaching for?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oftentimes they think, is that guy associated with some kind of enforcement that's pushing this along to kind of, antagonize the crowd?
And if I'm understanding my genealogy or whatever correctly, the Proud Boys, weren't they a group that rose up in response to Antifa, where they were like, we're the Proud Boys, we're going to come in and protect people from Antifa when Antifa goes overboard or whatever, because Antifa was doing some violent stuff. Antifa does violent stuff occasionally. Then the Proud Boys came up, and they were like the quite violent themselves, right-wing backlash to this that would push that and push it and push it until it got to be the point last year where what characterized a political protest were the gladiatorial style combat, street fighting between dudes in Antifa garb and dudes in Proud Boys garb, and they were pretty much always dudes, although with some notable exceptions. But wasn't that how Proud Boys came to be?
I got to be honest, I don't know the origin of the
If I'm remembering it correctly, I think that's what it was. But please, if I'm wrong,
I don't know
somebody
of the Proud Boys.
That was at least a narrative about Proud Boys for a while, whether that was their genuine, incarnation or whether it was something else.
Yeah, but either way, at this point, it doesn't seem like this notion of a larger conspiracy is intact.
That doesn't seem like it is. And then you're left with, a mob mentality and the potential, okay, well, rhetorically, Trump, he went too far, that kind of thing. And now what do you do with that? What would it mean to push Trump out of our political system after he was already president?
Yeah.
Because there's this push from people like neocons on the right and the never-Trumpers that still remain. I saw an article on it just the other day where they were, how do we keep, basically asking the question, how do we keep Trump from retaking the levers of power in 2024?
That ship has sailed. I got to be honest. I don't think the issue is Trump in 2024. The issue is the fact that it happened in general. I mean, if you think of what's taking place now, the governor of Virginia, one of the candidates that's running for the governor of Virginia, made a point that if he was in Congress, he doesn't know if he would have certified January 6th election for Biden. At this point, even in Arizona, after going through all of that, nanometer analysis of voting machines or whatever, well, it comes back as Joe Biden wins it, and Trump is still saying, nope, I won that contest. He didn't care. And not just didn't care, the evidence was pretty clear at that point that Donald Trump lost. And, this show gave him the benefit of the doubt of saying, yes, do the investigations, let him do his lawsuits, because who knows? If Donald Trump is right, this is one of the largest conspiracies in the history of this country. You're basically usurping the government of the United States in order to put in Biden or something. And once that stuff runs out, they're saying crazy stuff, like the ghost of Hugo Chavez is coming back, and the pillow guy, and then the other woman, I can't think of her name. But all of this stuff at a certain point, all this stuff became weird and just off the rails at a certain point. And so he never cared about whether he won or not. And many of the other people that were backing him didn't care whether he won or not. They either was going to support him for political effect, or they were going to go along with it. Meaning this notion of the concession speech out the window. And I've said it on more than one occasion. The concession speech is one of the most important things in our politics. And yet, it's also one of those things that apparently has become less and less prevalent. And so now, when a person wins, instead of this notion of America being the most important thing or the highest priority and everything else being lesser than, I didn't vote for him, but he's my president. I hope he does well. It's no longer that. It's the Russians, pushed him over the finish line. It's this guy doesn't, is not legitimate president. Or in this case, Joe Biden didn't really win it. They stole it. So much so they'll go after the Capitol. I don't think the issue is Trump proper in 2024. I think the issue is the next guy that's more competent, that's more savvy politically, and a party that gets themselves into the mind space of maybe we don't want to deal with representative government anymore. I think that's the biggest issue, that it happened the first time around and there was no major consequence for it, meaning moral hazard applies. But I could be wrong. I mean, this seems worrying to me because I don't necessarily see where this turns into anything better. It just seems to get worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, well, and then you want to go into our break here, or do you want to keep on doing this?
Well, go for it.
Well, I don't want to take too long.
No.
And what topic were you going to hit?
I was going to do Julian Assange, but the thing is, we're going to be talking about Julian Assange all day.
All right. Well,
We can definitely talk about the thing because I don't think we have a guest on this one.
No, on this story?
Yeah.
No, sadly, right now we don't. Although we were planning on hitting it with John, actually. I do believe.
That's right. John
Kiriakou. But, okay, so no. A couple things. After that brief break, coming back into the transition here, coming back into it, basically. January 6th, you know what this makes me think of, man? You're talking about, okay, each election that goes on, we criticize how people get elected. Yeah. We scrutinize it. You could go back to Bush v. Gore, of course, back in 2000 and the fallout from that. Then it simmered down for a while. 2008, we had the financial crisis. I remember the transfer from power from Bush to Obama. That was pretty smooth overall.
Very smooth. People were like, wow, where was this Bush? The entire presidency or stuff like that. Yeah.
Bush. And then it really starts to get fired back up when there is some actual genuine threat to the way the system works with Trump, who, whether you like him or not, was like a bull in a china shop running in, literally talking about a swamp and how we need to change everything about Washington. Doesn't really do nearly that much about it, but still, he does a bunch, and moreover, he says a bunch, and that freaks people out. Yeah. So in response to Trump coming in, everybody brings out, 3 sheets to the wind in our panic, and in the process, we ruin the boat.
Yeah.
And then 2020 hits, and of course, it swings back in the other direction. The point is, these last 2 cycles have gotten a lot worse in terms of the interregnum and in delegitimizing the administration to come.
Yeah.
And of course, the expectation, as you said, 2020 already happened, January 6th already happened. It's probably going to be something quite a bit worse, and then something worse than that, until something revolutionary happens. And revolution could be peaceful, or it could be not peaceful. You're worried about it being not peaceful. Yes. You're worried about somebody coming in, grabbing the levers of power and using it to violently move the cart in some other direction, maybe upsetting the whole thing, maybe killing people, maybe doing something truly, truly bad. And that's where it's worth keeping those things in the frame of our understanding as possibilities, of course, because those happen with revolutions, with any violent revolution, with any violent coup. There's either a little bit loss of blood at the top and a lot of chaos and discord in the rest of society, or worse yet, there's a lot of loss and blood throughout society as there's a war, as there's a civil war. That's what's on the table here, right?
And keep in mind, it's not going to be this transparent process. It's going to be done with this kind of, well, like Trump did. I was cheated. Oh, and you guys are going to help me, with this. And so we're going to, because what I think is going to happen is going to be something similar to the way Trump tried to do this, where they just blow off the responsibilities of the office. Like, think of Mike Pence. Mike Pence was getting a lot of credit, especially from liberals, because he was like, oh, Pence is going to be the guy who takes Trump out. Well, behind the scenes, Pence didn't want to do that. Pence was even talking to Dan Quayle on trying to figure out, is there a way for me not to certify this election? That is terrifying. I mean, even the Arizona thing where they're going into we're trying to find any and everything possible to prevent this from going forward. Or Raffensperger in Georgia, where Trump is pushing him, trying to get him to basically hand him over the election. I mean, that is extraordinary. And then you get 20 million people who says, okay, we'll go with that. It's like Hugo Chavez goes, yeah, that sounds about right. We'll go with that. No, man, that is disastrous. I mean, there's no way to have a representative government in the context of a system where neither side accepts the reality of the other side winning, where, public will at that point becomes not the main decision maker in the process, just who has the political advantage at any particular moment.
Well, but this is also, I want to step out for a second. There was an idea that I was thinking about over the weekend that could be just as dangerous, if not more dangerous. But let's throw in the internet and internet populism or digital populism, something like that for a second. We have a 2-party system that's overly corrupt, and so people get detached from it. And that's the theme of a lot of our show, frankly, is talking with people who are increasingly disillusioned with it and pushing away from it. They have nowhere to turn right now. A lot of these people, in their dejectedness, turn to the internet. They basically check out of political society and just entertain themselves with perfectly intelligent, rational conversation, and they're rational within some quotation marks, all over the place on the internet, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or in private forums, whatever. There's this mass of relatively intelligent, even politically engaged in a lot of cases, people who are just checked out of the political system proper.
Yeah.
Now, I want to put out not a hypothesis, but I want to put out something that could happen here. Whether it should or, whether it should is another question entirely. What if all those people came up with a policy platform and decided to, in first a small community and then a larger one as we got closer to the next major presidential election season, they came up with a policy platform and they're like, we're going to look everywhere for the best candidates to push this policy platform. And what is that policy platform? I don't know. But
pick the biggest three items that the American public agrees with.
yeah, it's probably major economic reform.
Yeah.
It's probably doing a lot of stuff economically. It would also be major political reform, and it probably wouldn't do all this stuff at once, but it would be promising all of it.
Yeah.
And it would basically put somebody into a position of power, and this is the critical part, where what they would do is, what they would have to do, I would think, is intelligently gut a lot of key institutions, whether that's the makeup of the White House. Now, I'm not saying everybody. I'm saying specifically people who are in intermediary positions. But the thing is, when we talk about a deep state or whatever, what we're talking about broadly are all of the unnamed masses living and working inside of these bureaucracies who make the system work. If you got rid of all of them, you'd have to build a completely new system. I don't know that you want to, but isn't this forget the internet thing for a second. You'd have to have, say one of our parties magically were rejuvenated and we're able to do this kind of thing. Isn't this the kind of thing you'd have to do to have some serious, deeper, meaningful reform? You'd want economic reform. You'd want political reform. You'd want a major change in the makeup of our government.
I'd go further.
You'd go further, but here's the thing.
I'd say that you have to do that. That's the only way.
I agree, but here's the thing, man. This is where I was going with all this. That would be painted as a coup. If you got a president elected in there who's like, my policy platform is to gut our institutions, expand and go beyond the executive power you're used to in this temporary transitional phase, that person would be painted as a demagogue if they appealed to the public. Yeah. And they would probably have to if this is going to, it would be a populist movement. Yeah. They'd be painted as a demagogue. They'd be accused of trying to stage a coup, over expanding presidential power. There would be worries that they would be trying to create a despotism out of America. Yeah. You see, isn't that the catch-22 that we're in here on some level?
On some level. So two things. One, I would say that would be critical and maybe the only way out. Meaning whatever else is going on, it doesn't seem like our solution is a political solution in the strictest sense of, okay, we go vote and the politicians do as they will and we'll get out. That doesn't seem to have worked. In fact, that seems to have got progressively worse as the public gets more disengaged. So I would say that plan or that playbook of the public basically asserting itself is probably what's necessary. On the secondary point, yes. The people who are there in power will probably consider that as this guy's a demagogue, this guy's pushing for this or that. But the catch is there's no clean win, meaning there's never going to be a situation where our system has gotten this frayed and belligerent where we were going to stand out there without any injury or damage. I mean, it was always going to be this kind of fight in order to change things back around. And even if you get, 52-48, with the 52 wins, well, 48 is going to hurt. Like, it's this notion that we're going to accept damage one way or the other, however we extricate ourselves from it, but it's necessary. I mean, when we're getting into various issues, whether it's climate, whether it's political intrigue, or this kind of what we see seemingly the disintegration of the political process, those are big, big issues that need to be, on some level, resolved. I mean, even this distrust in institutions, distrust in those are things that are going to unravel this country over the course of time. I mean, we could see it just in the elections where one party just says, yeah, I'm not going to concede. And then the other party says the Russians are helping that guy win. Like, those things are problematic just from the sake of governance in and of itself. That stuff has to be resolved. Now, I would argue that it would need something like the public as a tip of the spear, the public saying, this is what we want. Here are the policies, I don't know. Pick three, whatever the top three. And have the public saying, yeah, we're going to back that. And you get mass support for those policies. At the point where you get mass support, though, they can say whatever they want. I mean, they said all sorts of things. They called Trump everything but a child of God. Donald Trump still won. I mean, he didn't have any of the newspapers on his side. The people laughed at him. There were 20-something other Republicans. It didn't matter. He had a population that basically says, I want that guy because I am so sick of the others. And so it's doable. But yeah. He will be painted a particular way because that's the way that you try to go after somebody who's going to kind of use the crowd and the mob as their political weight and juggernaut. But I would say I don't know any other way out of it outside of something like that.
I agree. You know what? This might seem kind of tangential, but it also relates to the guest to whom we will be going on the other side of this short upcoming break. We're going to be talking with Peter Coffin. We're going to be talking about Facebook, social media. We're also going to be hitting this. I'm sure we're going to be revisiting this conversation. Yeah. This is, at this point in America's long-term political crisis, all roads sort of lead back to this question. This is our Rome or something like that, where we're What is the future of the political makeup of our society? How do we get there? We're in a long-term crisis right now. How do we get out of it? What's coming on the other side? Anybody who like asks those deeper political questions is, their questions are about this one here in the States, right? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But another side of this, and again, something I want to come back to here, is what media people choose to listen to. The new brand, and it does seem to be quite new, there's like a wave of it ongoing right now, and I really hope it comes to something, of whether it's Substack or however people are doing it, even just YouTube channels, although the paid versions are better. Replacing the media, replacing the mainstream quote-unquote media, replacing old media with new media, where people, breakout journalists, like the people who actually make the New York Times money, the people who actually made The Intercept money, people who made these companies money, who like broke the stories, who did the real work that people wanted to read, those people breaking away, doing their own journalism, effectively as weird kind of public patron freelancer types, getting $50, $100, whatever donations on an annual or a monthly basis from people. Those people who are making their own new news, their own new news media, those are where if we can support those people, if we can do whatever we can to give those people our money and our attention and our time instead of the old media, and if we can hold those people to the absolute highest ethical standards and create this high road, low road dichotomy between the really crap stuff that we're used to paying attention to and the actually genuinely really good stuff that's coming up on the internet. If you can create an alternative media structure, auxiliary structure, to go alongside this political reform process online, then you're cooking with fire. Yeah. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because so often with a case...
To that point, you get the media arm and the political arm, and those things run in tandem.
And it's not that when you say you don't want like any one group of people to be in control of those things. Au contraire, you want it to be the exact opposite. Under the current status quo, mainstream media is controlled by entrenched interests, very obviously, and so is our government. I was reading this good thread on China the other day about how that's exactly the problem they see in our political system, is that we are overly controlled by rent-seeking elites. I agree. That's true. And we need to rip them out of influence in every relevant sphere of power in our society. But you know what? Is it cool with you if we go into our break now? I was just spieling on that for a little while, trying to set us up, trying to prime the pump, get our juices flowing for Peter Coffin, video essayist on YouTube, over 250,000 subscribers, also a podcaster and author. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. When we come back, we'll be speaking with Mr. Coffin, with Peter, about Facebook going to war to defend its image. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be right back.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime.
I like beer. Yeah, we drank beer.
Whoever's in charge, and I want the record. Let's
talk about that.
Discussing all the controversies and news across the disunited states of America. Tune in to Fault Lines every weekday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern, only on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So Facebook is not going to take it anymore. No more apologies. This is the article's title. No more apologies inside Facebook's push to defend its image. And what this boils down to is Facebook basically using its system itself as a way to change people's opinion of Facebook. Basically using the news feed and putting out articles that are pro-Facebook articles. What they're hoping is to change how people perceive the company. If you remember, there were all sorts of crises, if you want to call it that were basically racking Facebook. Everything from disinformation, even the vaccine thing, where they found that disinformation was one of the major items on their platform. You had him wrapped on the knuckles in front of Congress. Facebook hasn't necessarily been having an easy go of it. And at this point, they're not going to take it anymore. And they're going to use their platform and the propaganda weight of that platform to do something about it. To have a conversation about this, we're joined with Peter Coffin. Peter Coffin is a video essayist with over 250,000 YouTube subscribers, podcaster, and author. In their book, Custom Reality and You, they explore how reality works in a world where profit is the driving force. Relatable humor and a commitment to everyday people keeps their left perspective fresh and, most importantly, sharp. Peter, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be back.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I'll just read this part. It says the idea that was pushing pushing pro-Facebook news items, some of them written by the company, would improve its image in the eyes of its users. 3 people with knowledge of the effort said. Now, they were calling this Project Amplify. And, you know, on some level, Facebook does have a huge amount of weight. By the same token, there's been a lot of issues that have been availing them. So right here, we have a situation where Joe Biden basically made the point that a social network was killing people by spreading COVID misinformation. There was another situation with Reuters that storming the U.S. Capitol was linked in some way to Facebook, meaning this kind of organization associated with it. And, you know, from this point, do you think this is going to work? I mean, or is Facebook's identity so already ingrained into the society itself that this is basically peeing in the wind? What are your thoughts?
Well, I do think it's kind of the ultimate test of their ad plan.
Yes.
If people see this and they see, well, Facebook can't seem to mop up its own image by being blatantly propagandistic on its own platform. I don't know how well that platform works, but yeah, it's pretty wild because looking at this, like, we all know that advertising is a form of propaganda. We all know that it is just it's sorting through like a company's image, taking out the bad things and only showing us the good things, showing us what we're supposed to think about them, et cetera, et cetera. But it's so blatant here, and it's so, as you said, contradictory to the actual public image of Facebook. And the thing that we actually have to worry about, or rather Facebook has to worry about, is, are they really that good at pushing, you know, a viewpoint? I mean, if yes, indeed, the most viewed post on the site for the time period that they had done that investigation on was a vaccine misinformation post, and that indeed had some effect on, like as Joe Biden said, killing people. Is that even something that they can mop up their own image with? I don't know. I've been, you know, considering this since this article came out, and I think that they may have a lot more trouble than maybe they've set out for. Like, this meeting that they had where they began Project Amplify was back in January. I'm sure that it's probably evolved a lot since then, but you know, looking at it, it seems as though they've really set out on a path that's going to be difficult for them. On the other hand, if they do succeed with this, it's blatantly like the implications for it are much worse than just like Facebook can lie about its public image to people and get people on board with them. Like, in theory, they would prove that their platform is viable for all kinds of worse misuse than vaccine misinformation. We could have the U.S. state utilizing this platform for much more nefarious purposes.
We would assume they are. At least that's my assumption. I don't know, man. Where my mind goes is where this problem is ultimately going to go. Like, and I don't know. But what I feel, and that's exactly the epistemic validity of what I'm about to say. This is less than prognostication. This is a feeling. It feels to me like people distrust social media more than ever. That trend is not going to be artificially stopped by any given, you know, any one of the company's attempts to push it back in the other direction with pro Facebook or pro Twitter, PR, whatever. That when I use these applications, just based on my personal experience, I don't trust the app itself. About as, you know, I can throw my phone across the room, and that's about as far as I trust these apps. Is, you know, not very far at all. the algorithm's going to try to lie to me to represent various moneyed interests who either want to advertise things to me or who want to suppress opinions that will affect their bottom line in some way. And we could be talking about the company there or the advertisers or, frankly, the CIA itself and, the other members of the intelligence community. What I do trust on these platforms is individual people. If I read through somebody's feed, I don't, at least yet, feel like, oh, the CIA has, they're using them as a puppet. I trust individual people on these platforms. So when it comes to news, there are a couple of people I like. I'll throw one out because I kind of gave him a nod earlier. Glenn Greenwald, fan of that guy. I follow him on Twitter. He's one of the few people I do follow. And I can read what he writes directly, technically with the app as an intermediary. But I'm not relying on the algorithm, hopefully, for all that much there. I can just go to his page and read it whenever I want to. In other words, social media apps may be, I don't know that they're going the way of the dodo quite yet. I don't want to get that far. But the media ecosystem has developed so that social media apps can be used primarily as a means of discovery, of discovering people. And then you can either keep subscribing to them on that app or subscribe to them over on Substack or YouTube or whatever, these other platforms. In other words, we might come to distrust the platform more and more, but hopefully we will still be able to use it to discover individual people and to prop them up. That's, I think, where it leads. What tools are best for doing that? Is it social media or is there some other discovery engine? I don't know. That's sort of not the topic of the conversation, but that's where I see it going. Now, whether that breaks down cataclysmically into a much more complicated ecosystem of different social media apps that appeal to different audiences. That's where, what some people were speculating for a while there. It doesn't seem to have happened yet. I don't know where that goes, but that's that's where I see it going. What do you think, Peter?
Well, with Substack and all that, you have what is ostensibly a much more neutral platform. That's the thing that they're attempting to sell themselves as. Like, they're much more neutral. They're much more hands-off. They're not necessarily a recommendation engine. You're kind of coming toward Substack with who you're looking for in mind, like, for instance, Glenn Greenwald or any number of other people that I've seen. And, I mean, from the perspective of, like, where the company itself is coming from, it's a little bit less hazardous because, they can't necessarily restrict your flow of information to that person. You're always able to manually simply go to that person's Substack page. But I will say on YouTube, which is where I publish my documentaries and my podcast Pact that I do with my partner, we do deal with an issue algorithmically in terms of whether or not subscribers even get our video.
Yeah.
They will throttle that based on if the has clicked it. Like if somebody misses a video in the subscription feed, they'll show our videos to them less. So, there's a potential for sort of the types of things. But if you're just, I know that I can go to glenngreenwald.substack.com and see the latest thing from Glenn Greenwald. It's much harder for them to make you miss the latest thing from Glenn Greenwald that way. So, there's I don't trust these large companies. I don't trust Substack as a company. I don't trust any of these things. But I do at least think, like, when people are more mentally subscribed, they understand, like, hey, these companies aren't necessarily working in our interests, and they aren't necessarily intending to show us everything. And at some point, they may shift their model to something where the content creator themselves has to pay to make sure, like Facebook, to go back to them, they have a model where in order to make sure that everybody who's actually following your page sees your posts, you have to pay them for it. And that could be something that Substack does. That's something along the lines of what MailChimp does, which is, sort of, I would call a forerunner to Substack. Substack's a little bit more like Medium combined with MailChimp, but I don't know. There's a lot of potential for misuse, but I think if these content creators go into it with the mind, like, I am the person that you're subscribing to, these platforms are not necessarily, like, while they may offer an opportunity here, you need to understand that you have to be mentally subscribed. You need to come to me manually. You need to specifically come here. And then there's still, to at least some extent, influenced by market forces and in what they cover, and like they have to keep people's interest still as well in order for that model to work out. So there's a lot at play, but hey, I do see it as better. I think you were leaning towards that in the previous segment. I'm seeing a situation where as long as people understand, like, these companies aren't necessarily to be relied on, and I am moving towards this individual content creator or this podcast or this video creator or whatever, it is at least better. I don't know if I would call it ideal, but like we're not going to get the ideal situation under this economic system. There's so many forces at play at any given time. So, I mean, I tentatively say I think it's better, this Substack model.
You know, I think it's a little bit of both on some level. I mean, like the Afghan files from the Washington Post. I don't know if the Substack would ever give me that. Or, you know, and I guess they could if they come together and they have enough revenue and enough resources where they can do their own private investigations and everything else. But oftentimes it seems that a lot of the Substack is picking up media stories and going further into it in a way that media doesn't necessarily do, or giving more context. And so it's like with this kind of combination of the two, I do think it's a better outcome. One of the interesting things, at least for Facebook, and one of the things they've gotten a lot of criticism about, is dealing with disinformation. And, you know, how do you deal with disinformation on a site that's supposed to be somewhat of a publisher as opposed to somewhat of a platform as opposed to a publisher? And one of Facebook's main things, they were doing research, and what they found was the main article, or the main, one of the most popular sites or the most popular post was basically disinformation on the vaccine. Like, where's, from your standpoint, where's the line for that? I mean, because at a certain point, it seems like it's screaming fire into a crowded theater. By the same token, it is social media, and people are going to be social and say all sorts of things in the context of that social media. What's the demarcation point? What's the middle ground in trying to deal with this? Or is there a middle ground? Is this just purely an ideological perspective of whether or not lies can be put out on these kind of massive platforms, or should something be done about it? I'm just curious. This is not an easy question.
No, it's not, but it's one that I think we have all had to grapple with to at least some extent, because, you know, my previous the documentary I most recently put out was called Free Speech Extreme, and it's about how free speech, like the person who has free speech is the person who owns the platform. It's not the person who is writing for a platform, and ultimately, in terms of the legal liabilities, Facebook has the discretion. Like, they can do what they want. But at the same time, that is an exertion of power over people saying what they want. Like, what real harm is being done? And I would argue that there is most certainly some harm being done in the vaccine issue. What exactly is their role in that? Like, Facebook is, of course, not a state actor, so they don't necessarily have the same position in terms of that. It's a really difficult question to answer. What is the middle ground? I don't know if there's a middle ground, because at some point, Facebook either needs to make the decision where they're going to remove the content or keep the content. And if they remove the content, that whole group of people is going to be incredibly pissed off. And they're going to either lose them to an alternative platform, or they're just going to become less engaged and therefore less valuable to Facebook. So you have a market force at play, and then you have a scientific force at play. What is real versus what is profitable. And in terms of a value judgment, I would obviously side on what is real, like what evidence points to ultimately, but I don't know that they will do that. I would think that unfortunately, I would always say that I think that a large company like that would go for the market before the science. And in a lot of cases, the market can look like science too, because you'll have the fetishization of science as a profitable means to sort of seed information. Like, people will act like science is infallible, and they'll say incorrect things in the name of science. I mean, there's a lot at play, but I think ultimately, like, if you want my prediction on what Facebook will do, I think that they will continue to allow that stuff, because I think that it's the implication of disallowing it is a large demographic of people, which becomes either less active or migrates to a different platform.
I think some of those ships have already sailed, though, which is why this one was weird. But just the other day, a listener, a frequent caller to the show, sent us a link via Twitter. And like it's, Project Veritas, James O'Keefe, relatively controversial dude across a lot of the mainstream media. Anyway, whatever an individual's opinions on James O'Keefe are, the listener to the show sent us a link to a video by James O'Keefe. And it was in a private DM. It wasn't a public post. Private DM straight to our Fault Lines Radio Twitter handle. And the link was obscured. It said something like, this message is hidden due to suspicious content. To see it, I clicked on that. Okay, it pops open the link. I can see the link again, basically. So I click through the link. Then there's another page that's like an intervening obstacle page that has, and it's a sort of one of those long, like if you're on Chrome, for instance, and you try to go to a website and it's like an unsecured website, that kind of page where there's like a little link at the bottom that you can click to continue, but basically they don't want you to access this page, whether we're talking about Chrome or another browser in this specific case. So I had to click through two separate links to get to the link. Now, that's an impediment. That's a disincentive. That's going to keep a lot of random innocent observers who are getting sent this stuff away from it. And hey, if it's disinformation, then I get the platform wants to put those obstacles up to, impede the flow of that info. But from my perspective, I'm left pissed, kind of disoriented a little bit. Like, wait, what am I even? What do you not want me to see? For the first 30 seconds, I genuinely am just irritated at them for keeping me from seeing whatever it is they don't want me to see. All of the ire is addressed at the company, none of it at the article. So in trying to keep me from getting to the content, they're making themselves less trustworthy. They're lowering their reputability in my eyes or whatever. And I see that writ large across all of society. Anybody who's even on the border of one of these fringes when it comes to a given news story, if they're looking into alternative, stories or whatever, whether they're right or they're wrong, all of the ire is addressed at the company. Who are you to keep me from seeing this, basically? Let me see it with my own eyes. Let me judge it with my own eyes. That's the impression. Doesn't matter how informed you are. Doesn't matter what your IQ is. That's the impression that people across the broad spectrum of society are left with when they read this stuff. And in its own way, that's a completely valid impression. But one note of optimism here. Hopefully, I'm not a big crypto guy. I don't own any crypto personally. But, people talk about it and play different parts of it up. One cool thing would be like an ownerless company or something. There are these distributed autonomous organizations, a social media or tech sharing company, something like that. I'm literally throwing things at the wall to see what sticks, but something like that, because you're talking about the ownership structure. As long as a company has a bottom line and an LLC attached to them in some way, they're going to be bound to the legal system, bound to the politics in the states. They're going to be pressured in the same way that Facebook and Twitter are. My point is there needs to be some exception to it, something outside of it, right? What's your take on that broad idea, Peter?
Well, I do agree there needs to be things outside of it. Broadly speaking, and the other thing you're alluding to is the idea that the ire goes to the company, and that's exactly it. I think you see Twitter.com has kind of exemplified that reaction. I mean, Twitter has, I would say, arguably catered more towards the liberal side of the demographic than the conservative one. I don't know if I'd say the same for Facebook, but I mean, exactly. You see it, the ire moving towards them as opposed to towards the misinformation or towards what is going on, because people can't really see for themselves what they're doing. An organization outside of that structure, like you said, maybe something autonomous, which isn't necessarily owned by any specific party, and it could, in theory, move in the direction of at least giving people the ability to verify things on their own. But part of that, the flaw I see in that is that having a completely autonomous, ownerless organization in a system that is ultimately dictated by an owning class, you end up, I think, with a situation where you have either AI or a council, or you have some sort of body that is ultimately directing it, and that thing will become a de facto owner, whatever that is. So, I mean, if that is kept under, and I'm really having to think hard for this here, or to reach deep.
You're playing devil's advocate here, though. I hear you.
Yeah, I do think that you would end up, with kind of a de facto ownership of it by some group of people, and if those people are really committed to the purpose of that, which is for it to only be this totally neutral force, it's possible that it may maintain that. But it's also possible, my brother works in a local paper, and he has decided to stop covering these meetings that are going on in the town hall about whether or not kids should have to wear masks at the school. He's just decided to stop covering it, which is that's a human decision affecting what people in the town are going to see in the newspaper. And it's not necessarily that he's overtly political. He's just tired of doing these meetings. They do like every 2 or 3 days and have been for like weeks and weeks at this point. It's just fatigue is changing the media landscape. And it's obviously a traditional media. It's a small town paper. But even if you have people that are very committed to this purpose of a neutral platform that is outside of this entire ecosystem, you do ultimately have to have something directing that platform. And those people could very well express those same types of biases, although obviously it would be very different than what story do I write today. It may be, expressed in a totally different way, but people still get fatigued on issues. People still get their own opinions on them. They get tired of it. They get angry about it. They get whatever. And I think you're ultimately going to have that at some point. And a platform that is explicitly designed to be outside the ecosystem and totally neutral, it's still going to ultimately have to be directed in some way, especially given the type of system we live in. So I think there is still possibility for problems there. But, I mean, people also, to go against the devil's advocate here, it would be lovely to see someone try to solve this problem rather than to see Facebook decide, oh, well, we have to start propagandizing it. Sure.
We just start advertising to Facebook users how good we are because of how pissed they are at us for doing what we've been doing. One quick thought, these are platforms, a video game joke. Anybody who's played platformers, the video game style, knows when you jump on a platform, it starts to fall. Like people who play Mario,
yeah.
You jump on one of those platforms. At a certain point, you can't rely on that thing forever. You can't trust it. Maybe it's the same here. But, I get that's a little bit disorienting depending on how quick the churn is or whatever. But nothing, and so, nothing is new under the sun. Everything fades away in some sense, repeats itself, and hopefully you're left with what's good enough for now. And it seems that because Facebook's having to reassert itself to us, to prove itself to us that it's good enough, they're having to advertise themselves to us, they're probably not good enough at this point. And we do need something better, and hopefully it works.
Absolutely. Nothing to add. Fantastic.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, I feel you. I think invariably something makes a choice, either in what to expose, what to show, where the camera or where the microscope is going to go. But yeah, it would be great to have something. I guess I just don't know what that looks like, and maybe that's kind of the hardest part of this. Peter, thank you for joining us, man. I really appreciate it. Peter Coffin is a video essayist with over 250,000 YouTube subscribers, podcaster, and an author. In their book, Custom Reality and You, they explore how reality works in a world where profit is the driving force. Relatable humor and a commitment to everyday people keeps their left perspective fresh, fun, and most importantly, sharp. You can follow Peter on YouTube, Patreon, and Twitter at Peter Coffin, and purchase this book on Amazon.
Also, check out Pact. We haven't been advertising this, but Peter and a partner have a podcast. Go check that out. PACD. Mm-hmm. Peter Coffin, Miss Astronaut Cowboy Doctor. PhD. Go check that out. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this short break.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I'm your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in this corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That strongly implies that you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get to the headlines. In the news, about 34,200 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, and there were about 281 deaths reported. That number is always low on Monday. Over the past week, there's been an average of 119,883 cases per day, a decrease of 18% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 55% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 64% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 42,905,619 human beings across the United States and has killed an unfortunate 688,157 men, women, and children. Under the Trump administration, the CIA floated kidnapping and or killing Julian Assange while he was being housed in an Ecuadorian embassy in London. Yahoo News reported over the weekend that the actions being considered were part of a larger plan to surveil Assange and WikiLeaks associates, sow discord within the organization, and steal their electronic devices. The report is that the CIA leadership, including Mike Pompeo, sought revenge for the release of Vault 7, a major release by WikiLeaks of hacking tools used by the CIA. The release led Pompeo to publicly classify WikiLeaks as a non-state hostile intelligence service, quote unquote, a designation which significantly broadens the scope of what would be considered reasonable response. I remember when Vault 7 was released, and they released all of these hacking tools where they were able to mimic signatures of other countries. Meaning the moment that Vault 7 was released, the idea that a country did X was out the window. You found that there were all sorts of tools that allow you to mimic the actions of other actors. I mean, it was a massive, massive release, and yeah, they were embarrassed by it. The recent salmonella outbreak in America has reached 279 reported cases and 8 hospitalizations. Cases have stretched across 29 different states. Samples from restaurants in hotspot areas have detected salmonella in a condiment cup containing onion, cilantro, and lime. It is impossible to tell which of these foods were tainted with bacteria. That sounds funny. It sounds like it's salmonella with a dash of cilantro.
Exactly. I'm not regretting my decision to eat at the delicious place with the, have those tacos the other day, but could I please have some salmonella with my cilantro and sliced onions? That would be delicious.
The FBI is opening an investigation into the officers involved in a suspect takedown of a police dog. Oh, I see. Let's try this again. The FBI is opening an investigation into officers involved in a suspect takedown after a police dog was allowed to bite a suspect repeatedly. Officers in Woodson Terrace, Montana, were called when a man had broken into a business. He was confronted, appeared to be on drugs, and threatened officers. After being warned that the dog would be released, and a cell phone footage shows the canine handler allowing the dog to bite the man for about 30 seconds. The man attempted to get up, stumbled, and the dog engaged the other leg for another 30 seconds. Woodson Terrace is fully cooperating with the federal probe. Abortion clinics in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma are reporting at least 2/3 of their patients are coming from Texas, with most restrictive abortion laws in the country recently sworn into the state legislation. Texas residents must go elsewhere when seeking an abortion. Prices for these procedures are going up, along with the waiting times. I guess that would happen. That or clothes hangers.
Oh.
Well, that's what the practice used to be. I mean, if you don't allow it to be legal.
I know, and that was a kind of performative. But also, that's painful. There are other ways to I'm just
induce an abortion.
Saying this to induce miscarriages at steps in the process than literally a coat hanger. That's the worst of the worst. That's the worst. That's the worst of the worst. Is exactly right.
In yesterday's German elections, the center-left party, SDP, has won a narrow victory, taking just under 26% of the vote. Yeah, I was watching this. Angela Merkel soon will be no more. The United States is calling on Iran to allow American watchdogs to access a workshop at the Tessa Karja complex and reinstall cameras as agreed. If they fail to do so, the United States stated they would consult with the other board members of the International Atomic Energy Agency and respond appropriately. Let's come back to that. The Taliban have petitioned the rest of the world to resume international flights in and out of Afghanistan. This comes as a vast majority of the foreigners left in the country during the Taliban takeover and shopkeepers cannot move their products. The Taliban seem to be inviting the rest of the world to treat and trade with them as they would any other country. A shortage of truck drivers has resulted in a disruption in the supply chain for UK gas stations, or as they would like to call them, petrol pumps. Panic buying has contributed to the worsening of this problem, as for the fourth day in a row, stations are having gas lines. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is considering sending in the army to deliver fuel to the stations, hopefully relieving the shortage. In Earth and Science news, as the Space Race 2.0 ramps up, NASA, like many other occupations in this country, needs more employees, specifically astronauts. Their clever solution is to release an augmented reality graphic novel. The comic follows the story of fictional Callie Rodriguez as she becomes the first woman to the moon or on the moon. Pointing your phone at the special XR codes within the story would allow you to tour the Orion spacecraft, play games, watch videos, and earn badges. Very interesting. Facebook is rebutting a report put out by Wall Street Journal claiming that Instagram was a quote-unquote toxic app for the company. They stated that those dealing with the body issues could make their feelings worse. However, those coping with loneliness, anxiety, sadness, eating issues said the app helped them in difficult moments. The Wall Street Journal found 13% of British teens and 6% of American teens trace suicidal thoughts back to Instagram. Wow. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's stay there for a moment. There have been conversations about what would a telepathic civilization look like. Like if you were in a situation where each person basically had the capacity to know what was in your head at any particular moment, any random thought, any random feeling, any random emotion, and what would humanity be in that situation? Like what would we look like and what would society look like? Well, we don't necessarily have that. For the most part, our thoughts are our own to varying degrees. I mean, things leak out in regards to how we engage. But all things being equal, for the most part, our thoughts are our own. Facebook, on some level, Twitter, on some level, even you can make a case as Instagram. These things, in some odd way, is kind of getting around that. I mean, it gives more information than would have typically been allowed if the person was just single-handedly dealing with the other person. And what people regard as being the best case scenario for somebody else, meaning the person is putting on this is the best case of the particular life. Look at the friends, look at the trips, look at the vacations, look at what I am doing. Here's my husband, here's my kids, and everything else. Now, he could be abusive. She could be getting abused. The kids could be horrible. But the pictures give this kind of impression of something else, best case scenario. The thing is, if your life is, let's say, hitting the skids, or if your time is somewhat difficult, if you have your own body issues, and on some level, I can imagine, see how it may exacerbate that stuff when you're looking and comparing it to the Joneses. It's uber interesting. I mean, but I don't know what way around that. Anywhere you are is where you're at with that. I mean, at the end of the day, if somebody's putting out a picture, they're not going to put them a worse or horrible picture out. You wouldn't think so. And if they're going to present something about themselves, they're not putting necessarily the worst case scenario out. They're probably going to present the best case scenario. And at a certain point, I guess individuals who have self-esteem issues or have other issues that are going on in their life, it may make that situation worse. But again, I don't necessarily know a way around that. I mean, it's just kind of an is what it is thing. I mean, what do you think? I mean, what if it's true, what should they do about it? Or should you do anything about it?
Well, that's where the rubber meets the road, as the saying goes proverbially. I'll put it like this, man. Every one of the arguments that pertains to this situation applies, in my opinion. They're all valid arguments. Yeah. What it actually comes down to is, okay, what are we going to do about it? We flesh out a couple different sides of it. For one thing, just because, and these are ones that I don't heard getting said so often, just because somebody's on Instagram and getting depressed over people on Instagram doesn't necessarily mean in the moment it really has anything to do with Instagram.
Right.
I have, just me personally, like pretty much every person on the face of this earth, got some weird self-image issues. You know, I'm insecure in different ways. I don't like how my body looks when I look in the mirror. When I, change my face into a certain facial expression and I look in the mirror, then I'm satisfied, but otherwise I kind of don't like how it looks. That's true for like people in general, I think, unless you have a really strong, secure self-image, which takes work usually and like a good upbringing and probably some good genetics, all that stuff. People just have problems. And then we look on Instagram where people are doing these Facetune things, and we in our lonely apartment see them getting hundreds of thousands of likes for living effectively a lucky life, what seems to us like a lucky life. How is that Instagram's fault? Is that their fault? Is that our fault?
Yeah.
All of the questions that we're asking have answers. We have to answer them for ourselves. And where the rubber meets the road is when we have to ask the policy questions. Are we going to ban Instagram? Is Facebook going to have to implement algorithmic controls so that less attractive people aren't advertised more attractive images or whatever? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like there's anything to do about it.
I don't know. For any individual, so where the rubber meets the road in terms of politics is, okay, how are we going to control this? Where the rubber meets the road for you as a person who's depressed looking at Instagram, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to stay on Instagram and stay depressed and stay in this trap, the narcissistic bubble trap, where you artificially overinflate your self-worth some of the time, and then at night, in the middle of the night, you ask yourself, is it all worth it? Am I really ugly? Those kinds of questions. Do my followers mean something? Because even the people with a lot of followers on Instagram aren't necessarily happy. You know what I mean? I guess my point is, for any individual person, you have to ask yourself how you're going to relate to it. Valid question to ask publicly. You know what? I've mainly been stalling so that I can have time to come up with a response. If I had a solution, I would ban Instagram. I would ban Facebook. I would ban phones. And I would replace them with stone tablets in cuneiform that we had to read every Sunday.
That way nobody has to deal with the image of the supermodel.
Exactly.
Or something like that.
Just get rid of computers, man.
That brings another point. What about supermodels? I mean, there was always, like Sports Illustrated. You have these athletes, these, godlike men, alpha males running to catch balls or dribbling or whatever else. I mean, weren't they always there? I mean, isn't it on some level the same thing? Or is it because, well, those people are rich and famous, they feel like they're separate and distinct. There's something else. They're untouchable. Whereas, Tim, that's on Facebook with the wife and the kids and everything else, is more touchable, and his life is much more better than my own. I mean, it seems like an individual thing in a way that the person is basically relating to the world of sorts. I still say
it is. And that's where it's like a profound spiritual exercise, maybe almost even, where it's like, okay, this is how seeing this person behave makes me feel. That interpretation of events is completely on my end.
Yes.
Granted, it's been conditioned by social circumstances and it's genetic, by depression or however I receive this. That some people are just,
hardwired in some kind of weird way.
They're congenitally sanguine. In great spirits, or they're congenitally depressed. You know what I mean? There are all these arguments that apply. But for me personally, what does this teach me about myself? What can I learn from my reaction to this? Because if seeing other people be happy consistently makes me feel bad, and for me personally, at some of the darker moments in my life, that's been true. It's like, why can't I have that? Why am I so, all these things? Why am I so XYZ? Then what do you do in response to that? Hopefully you learn from it, you grow from it, you grow stronger, you grow more loving, you accept those people, you accept yourself first and most.
It's that part.
I don't mean to be too pedantic, but there's like this process here. There's a way to deal with these problems and grow from them.
Yeah.
And all I would wish upon society is that we do so.
As opposed to offing yourself. Yeah, I think it's that one. Accept yourself. I think it has to be, right? I mean, otherwise, because I don't see the point in looking at somebody's page getting angry because they're so happy. It's like, how dare they be so happy with their great kids and they're great. And also, put it in perspective, right? Just because somebody puts a picture out there that they're smiling and happy doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually smiling and happy.
Yes.
I mean, think of, this is grim, but Patino. I mean, the stuff that they were putting out, this great couple that were supposed to be on this kind of van trip. And while they're on this van trip, it's supposed to be great. They're having a great time, fun, and everything else. And then you get police reports where the guy slaps her or hits her. These guys are having fights. They're not on good terms. And she ends up basically dead somewhere.
Yeah.
And so, if you would have looked at all of this, let's say back in June, you'd have been like, wow, she's having a great life. Those guys are doing great. But the reality of it was far, far darker. Just because it's a picture doesn't necessarily mean it's the reality of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what? A lot of this that we get of our guest, a lot of this stuff also, self-image also has to do with, you brought up the relationship, whether you're a single young man or a single young woman who's been alienated by from the other gender, however you want to look at it.
What do you call them? Incels.
Incels on the men's side, and then there's a bunch of different applicable parallels on the woman's side. But the situation broadly right now is people are having less sex than they used to. They're having less babies. They're waiting longer to have babies. Yeah. They're stuck at home. COVID hasn't made the situation any better, et cetera. And this is a social ill, or really a basket of social ills, all sort of wrapped together.
Yeah.
And if you're on if you're on Instagram despairing over your lack of likes or looking at people being happier, often those people are single.
Yes.
To be clear, what helps to get rid of what helps to blow that dark cloud away is getting into a productive relationship. And that is often a productive romantic relationship, not just a set of friendships,
Or connections.
So those kinds of connections, but romantic relationships apply too. It's rolled into all these other questions. And I guess what I wanted to get across, we got into that conversation pretty quickly there, and it's an interesting one to have. We moved away from Instagram. I think that is actually kind of valid. It's not just Instagram. It's not just one thing that's causing this depression. Instagram is eliciting those responses from people who have many other ills that they're expressing on Instagram that come to mind because they're on Instagram when they feel them, all that stuff. But blaming it on just the application seems like you're avoiding the real set of problems here, which are much more complicated and real.
1000% agree. 1000% agree. Let's do this. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to come back with John Kiriakou, always one of my favorite guests. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. A bombshell report came out over the weekend about the Trump administration and the CIA basically trying to murder or kidnap Julian Assange. I just read the headline. Under the Trump administration, the CIA floated the idea of kidnapping and or killing Julian Assange while he was being housed in an Ecuadorian embassy in London. Yahoo News reports that the actions being considered were part of a larger plan to surveil Assange and WikiLeaks, sow discord within the organization, and steal their electronic devices. The report is that the CIA's leadership, including Mike Pompeo, sought revenge from basically being embarrassed by the release of Vault 7, a major release by WikiLeaks of hacking tools used by the CIA. The release led Pompeo to classify WikiLeaks as a, quote, non-state hostile intelligence service, unquote, a designation which significantly broadened the scope of what would be considered a reasonable response. And keep in mind, this was also extended out to the likes of Glenn Greenwald, where they wanted to basically treat them as these kind of media assets as opposed to basically journalists. To have a conversation about the CIA's actions here, we're joined with John Kiriakou. John Kiriakou is a former CIA officer, co-host of The Backstory on Radio Sputnik, and author of books including The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. John, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Good to be back.
Absolutely. I know you've had to see this story at this point. What were your thoughts when you saw this? This is pretty wild. They were basically trying to murder a journalist after being embarrassed because of his releases. I mean, Vault 7 was a major, major release. I remember when that first came out. And to make this worse, people like Glenn Greenwald or Lori, Poitras, they wanted to use them as information brokers as opposed to being journalists. And, it's like changing the words around. Was there a way of trying to get around these kind of limitations that were there for either journalists or news organizations and allowed them to basically put that much more pressure or treat them a particular way? What did you think, just from your own personal experience, when you read this?
Well, we learned after the torture debate that the Justice Department can justify any crime that it wants to justify if the CIA asks it to. And for the CIA director at the time, Mike Pompeo, to float this idea at the highest levels of government and have support at the highest levels of government, meaning the president and the national security advisor, it just goes to show you the dangerous situation we have found ourselves in. This was an advanced plot to assassinate Julian Assange and to neutralize in some way one of the most important journalists in the world and one of the most important documentary filmmakers in the world. It's a crime that just leaves me speechless, honestly. I just, when I read this article yesterday, I couldn't believe what my eyes were telling me.
Really? Well, I want to go
Seriously.
back to when Vault 7 came out. A lot of this has to do with internal attitudes at the CIA, during the release of Vault 7, when Pompeo was director of the CIA. I would assume that you had contacts. I'm not asking you to break confidentiality to the extent that you can, of course, but I'm sure you would have heard from people. What were the impressions like from the inside of the CIA after the release of Vault 7, which broke massively tools used by the CIA to surveil people, and more, a lot more than that.
Yeah.
What was the CIA's feeling? What was what did you hear at the time?
Right. I do have a lot of friends still at the CIA, and we had these conversations. My friends at the CIA and I have agreed to disagree on a lot of these issues. They thought that it was such an important crime, a high crime, to release the Vault 7 information, but then stumbled over the fact that Vault 7 indicated that these methods were being used against Americans. They didn't want to talk about that. But I'll say something, too, that I learned in these conversations. Literally nobody liked Mike Pompeo as director of the CIA. Mike Pompeo is a fundamentalist evangelical Christian. He attended 6 different Bible studies a week inside the CIA. Rather than working, he was busy reading the Bible and would sign every official memo with "Have a blessed day." And people just didn't like it. They wanted him to get to work instead of imposing his religious beliefs on everybody. Well, it turns out that those religious beliefs didn't extend to "Thou shalt not kill," which is exactly what this article is about.
Well, thou shalt not kill or lie either, and he willingly did so in pursuit of the United States by his own words. This is pretty extreme, though. I mean, and this wasn't like low-level people. This was like at the top levels of the Trump administration, where they were basically talking about either rendition or basically murder. Also, it seems like they were willing to go through any notion of, I guess, international law. I mean, they would have had to blow off the Ecuadorian embassies and asylum in order to even do this. I mean, how common is this from the standpoint of a CIA operation?
Well, it's unprecedented, and it's even worse than that. This is the thing that was so shocking to me. What they were talking about was an actual shootout outside of the Ecuadorian embassy in order to snatch Julian Assange. Then they talked about shooting the tires of a Russian diplomatic plane to disable the plane so they could snatch Julian Assange off the plane. That's an act of war. Right? I mean, there's no getting around that. That is an act of war. You cannot shoot out the tires of a diplomatic plane and kidnap somebody from that plane. I mean, it's one thing to break the law. right? It's another thing to wage war against somebody. And let me ask, or not ask, but let me add another point. And that is that Julian Assange is an Australian citizen. And this is something that I've really stumbled over since this story broke. Australia is one of the Five Eyes countries, along with the United States, the UK, Canada, and New Zealand. And, you know, the Five Eyes countries don't spy on each other. They share all of their intelligence, right? No secrets between them. They don't spy on each other. They don't commit espionage. They do everything in concert. It's a full partner relationship. So for the United States to be able to plan the murder of an Australian national, a Five Eyes national, had to be in concert with the Australian government, which is unconstitutional on the Australian side. So I'd like to know also what the role of the Australians is. Mike Isikoff said in this article that all of this shootout nonsense and shooting out the tires of the Russian plane, this was all done in concert with the British, and that it was the British that were going to be doing the shooting. So, you know, we've just scratched the surface of this thing. It goes deeper than Mike Pompeo.
Very interesting. Of course, in the United States, that is the face for it. I actually saw somebody had on Twitter earlier on the show, earlier during the show this morning, they'd mentioned they'd been paying attention to. They were very curious to hear your take on this, specifically on Australia, because you would know better than I. That sounds pretty illegal. They would have to reject that notion. Otherwise, they would be assassinating an Australian citizen. They'd be assassinating a person in their own country on the pretenses that they're working for, I would assume, an unnamed foreign government or something, because this is right around the turn when Pompeo started, and again, not to focus overly on Pompeo, but when Pompeo started to frame...
he called it a non-state hostile intelligence service.
Exactly those words. So from the Australian side, that would be incredibly illegal, right? How would that work?
Incredibly illegal. Incredibly illegal. There's no way of getting around the illegality of this thing. And you're right. It's not just Pompeo. It's these other governments. What the United States and others have done in pursuit of WikiLeaks is something that I've just never seen before. And all of this, at least on the U.S. side, requires a presidential finding. It requires the president to sign a document called a finding, allowing them to institute a covert action plan. And so this isn't just Pompeo saying, "Oh, I really hate Julian Assange. I think we should kill him and have a shootout, in the streets of London." That's not how this works. The way it works is the CIA comes up with this stupid idea, and they go to the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, OLC. OLC has to determine that the plan is legal. Well, clearly it's illegal, but what OLC does and what OLC has done in the past, for example, with the torture program, with the secret prisons program, with the rendition program, is they just come up with some crazy interpretation of the law to allow the CIA to do what it wants. Once OLC approves it, it then goes to the National Security Council for the director to approve it. Once the director does, then it goes to the president for signature. And when the president signs that finding, the CIA can do whatever it wants. Wow. And I think that's exactly how this played out. This went all the way to Donald Trump. So when Isikoff says, I don't know why he was trying to be coy, but when he says it went to the highest levels of government, that means Donald Trump.
Yeah.
That means Donald Trump signed a finding.
And it made the point. Donald Trump reportedly spitballed on whether the CIA could kill WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. And by the way, even Obama, it says the notion of kidnapping Assange preceded Pompeo's arrival at Langley, meaning it busted him in meetings, even in the Obama administration, about whether or not to do something like this. One thing you said, though.
Yeah, the Obama administration, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Jamarl. The Obama administration was the enemy of transparency. Remember, it was the Obama administration that prosecuted 8 of us whistleblowers, almost 3 times the number of all previous presidents combined. So this is not just a slap at Donald Trump. Barack Obama was just as guilty as Donald Trump.
The Church Commission, you mentioned that the president basically has to sign a finding. And correct me if I'm wrong. Initially, the CIA, when its operations basically functioned in a way where it was somewhat of an independent body, where It did what it did because it was right, Meaning they, it's like whatever that's in the best interest of America from the CIA standpoint, that's what they could do. They didn't necessarily need the president to buy in. In fact, they didn't even want the president to buy in because they didn't want him to be politically liable for anything that they may do. They needed that lotion of separation. But it wasn't the Church Commission that basically ended that process where at that point there was supposed to be a presidential approval of various actions like this.
Great question. Great question. And here's how the CIA got around it. So you're right. When the Church Committee issued its report, one of the things that it did was it established the House and Senate Intelligence Committees to act as oversight committees. And that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to oversee the activities of the CIA. Now, one of my complaints over the years is that since the 1990s, the committees have acted as really no more than cheerleaders for the CIA. But that's not the case here. The case here is that when there's a covert action program, it has to be briefed to the committees. And if it's so sensitive that you really don't want anybody to know, you can brief it to what's called the Gang of Eight. That is the leaders of the House and the Senate, both parties, and the chairman and vice chairman of the two committees. And that way you can keep it as secret as possible. But if the CIA determines that this is not a covert action program per se, but instead is a counterintelligence operation, then you don't have to brief the committees. You don't have to tell anybody. And I think that's why Pompeo came out and said that WikiLeaks is a hostile non-state intelligence service, because that's what made it counterintelligence.
And this is
that way they didn't have to tell anybody.
That's the sort of an the hidden part of an iceberg, latent in claiming that WikiLeaks is a non-state intelligence service. How many times could you do that? How many crowds of people, anonymous people online, who are saying things you don't want them to say, justifying with absolutely no oversight, incredible intervention up to assassinations apparently. What are the if you were to look at this post-Church Committee, what would you do to try to rein the CIA back in? What would that take, John?
That's the slippery slope that we find ourselves in. What do? You have to. We're cursed with the system that we have, and so what you have to do is trust in the oversight committees to do their jobs, and we can't do that.
But what if they're not informed?
Out of control.
Like you mentioned yourself. They're not even informed.
They're not even informed.
Exactly.
No, Congress has to take this bull by the horns and update the Church Committee's findings. Right? It has to rein in the CIA and demand in the form of reform of a new law that the CIA be reined in. We can't. The current situation is untenable. We can't keep going like this. Because clearly the CIA does whatever it wants, whenever it wants. And it doesn't care about what the law happens to say. That's got to stop.
It's basically working in the shadows and coming up with justifications to not, to blow off oversight. I mean, this goes back to, I think it was Brennan spying on Congress and then basically lying about it after the fact to the same Congress that he spied on. There doesn't seem to be consequences with this stuff. I mean, they'll raid Roger Stone's house.
And in fact, when then Intelligence Committee Chairwoman Dianne Feinstein filed a crimes report with the Justice Department saying, that Brennan's people had hacked into the Senate computers, that was just dismissed. They didn't even bother to investigate it.
Interesting. John, there were a couple other things we wanted to talk about with you this morning. This has to do more with the FBI than the CIA, but recent revelations from January 6th show, of course, what you would have seen. The FBI had an informant who was marching on the Capitol, somewhere in the middle of the organization, not up at the top, although Enrique Tarrio, also head of the Proud Boys for a while there, and a former, potentially current FBI informant. In other words, they had a couple of people, both at the top and in the middle in the rank and file. This most recent report was about the rank and file member who said there was no premeditated conspiracy, at least as far as we can trust him and as far as he knew, to do January 6th, the event proper, to breach the Capitol building violently. in the way that they did. What's your takeaway from this? Do you think this makes the case for an entrapment theory? That's where some people are going or walking back from that. What do you think of the idea that there was something premeditated, but we're not hearing about it? This informant wasn't let in on it. Those seem to be the sort of frames on the, of this debate. On the one end, this was a conspiracy by Republicans, potentially Trump, but certainly Republicans, Republican militias. This was a premeditated conspiracy. That's one end of the debate, maybe. And then on the other, far end, this was entrapment. This was pushed by the government. That would be, those are both, I think, the extremes on this one. What's your take on it, John?
I don't really buy either one of those two extremes. I never saw a conspiracy when this started. To tell you the truth, and I'm sorry if this sounds harsh, but I saw a whole bunch of idiots moving on to Capitol Hill. The mob mentality took over, and it all got out of hand. I don't see it as, the greatest crisis since 9/11. I don't see it as an attempt to overthrow the government. I saw it as just a big group of dopes going too far. Now, with that said, I believe that the FBI had informants all over Capitol Hill that day. That's what they do. That's what they've always done. We know that Enrique Tarrio is a longtime FBI informant. We had him on our own show, and he made no apologies about being an informant, which is going to make his time in prison difficult. I can tell you that. But we also know from the Vietnam War era that there were demonstration planning sessions where everybody participating in the meeting was an FBI informant, and they would go back to their FBI handlers and all report on each other. In many cases, they were FBI agents who didn't know that the people they were targeting were other FBI agents, and they would report back on each other. I think that's what we're seeing in this situation.
Yeah, there were at least 3, and possibly more, given this kind of intel as it took place. And, from my standpoint, it was like you can't have it both ways. Either because the prosecution's case, or at the very least, it seems the prosecution is making an argument that this was concerted and a conspiracy among the organization itself. And it's like, well, you can't have it both ways. If the FBI has that many spooks that are basically keeping tabs on everything that's taking place, then how could it happen? Meaning that would have meant that the FBI basically allowed this particular thing to happen. So yeah, it seems that this was kind of haphazard. I'm curious though, how do they get these informants? I know there's some cases where the person may see something that freaks them out and they go. But all things being equal, true believers who are part of this organization, I mean, including Tarrio, how do they flip people like that to get them in? I mean, I would imagine this is true for the CIA or FBI.
Oh, sure. That's easy. You're charged with a crime, and they come and talk to you, and they say, listen, you can do 4 months or 6 months, or you can do 10 years. It's up to you. You can do the whole 10 in a medium security penitentiary, or you can do 6 months and you can report back to us. And most people are unwilling to do 10 years. That's how they work. They don't do it like out of friendship. At the CIA, the way we recruited people is we become their best friends and spend vast amounts of money on them and put their kids through college and take them on trips and do all kinds of great stuff. That's not how the FBI works. The FBI recruits people through threats of incarceration.
So honey on the one side, vinegar on the other. It seems like they both do work to catch flies. Just briefly, which would you prefer? Looking at them critically, which do you think is the better strategy? On a bit of a tangent.
Oh my God. Well, it depends. It depends what your goal is. If you,
John,
sorry, if you want somebody to work with you over the long term, you have to use the honey.
Yeah.
If you have a specific task and you just need for it to be done now, you use the vinegar.
So basically, the people who are informants, most likely because they were affiliated with the FBI, or under some kind of threat. Meaning either there were charges against them, there was something that they did that was illegal, where the FBI could say do X, or be our informant.
Precisely.
So blackmail, coercion, that kind of thing.
Well, look at Enrique Tarrio. He's been arrested a number of times on all different kinds of charges, mostly felonies. He's facing felony sentencing again. He was facing years in prison, and he got, 8 months? Mm-hmm. We got 8 months because he's been working with the FBI.
What does this do to organizations when they learn this? I mean, like, part of the article made the point of saying this is a dark, people got this kind of dark path. I mean, the level of distrust that it sows in the organization, I would imagine, is overtly significant.
And it has to be intentional, right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's the other part. Like Shane said, is it intentional?
Sowing the distrust.
Yeah.
Sure it is. Sure,
they didn't have to release this.
Our friend Medea Benjamin, the co-founder of Code Pink, told me a story one time that there was a woman who joined Code Pink, and she was going to every demonstration, and she was going to the events at the Code Pink house, and they planned one day a demonstration at Dick Cheney's house on Chainbridge Road in McLean, Virginia. And they said as soon as they walked onto the driveway, which was private property, this woman pulled out an FBI badge and shouted, "You're under arrest," and then grabbed one of the Code Pink protesters. So that's what they do. They infiltrate these groups. They sow distrust and discord. They try to disrupt, and then they move on. And then 6 months later, somebody else tries.
Wow. That is, I mean, and, this is taking place going all the way back to the 60s and before, where the feds will try to, because from their standpoint, they look at this stuff as anti-government, and they consider it their job to basically push back against groups that they think are undermining and subverting the government. So what do you think should happen here? I mean, basically, if the prosecution is coming out with this particular line of argumentation, it doesn't necessarily seem that the argumentation flies, meaning it doesn't seem that this was a concerted effort. Unless they were just being misdirected, which I don't entirely buy. I mean, it didn't come across that way in the article.
No, and you know what? I think that they understand that. I think that the FBI and the Justice Department understand that, and that's why the sentences so far for the January 6th rioters have been so light. Mm-hmm. If this was a 9/11 style conspiracy, a 9/11 style threat to overthrow the government, we would see sentences of 20, 30, 100 years. And we're seeing 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. That's it. Easy. Come and go. No problem. So I think that the argument that this was the gravest threat to our democracy, since the Civil War, I think it's nonsense. And they know it's nonsense.
You think it's a bit overblown, basically?
Very much so.
I want to get into, this is somewhat of a hard pivot, but I'm just curious about your take on it. So right now we have a situation where the Taliban wanted to join the United Nations to give their kind of a speech, which, they wanted to engage the world stage. They're also asking for flights to come into the country at this point. Again, this is another thing of them trying to engage the world stage, Taliban 2.0 as opposed to 1.0. If it's unclear how the United States is going to accept this or take this, meaning you're going to have countries like Russia, China, and some of the other surrounding countries that definitely seem that they're going to assist because it's in their best interest to assist. They don't want Afghanistan falling apart and becoming a failed state. It will be on their borders. But from the United States standpoint, sometimes we use sanctions. Sometimes we have these subversive elements in order to undermine countries we don't particularly like. Is that going to be the case for Afghanistan? I mean, do you believe that CIA, let's say the wolves, are going to be out to undermine any notion of Afghanistan? Or is it not in our interest for that country to basically fall apart, in which case the wolves are kept, let's say more so, at bay? What is your thought in regards to U.S. policy going forward?
Yeah, I don't think we care if Afghanistan falls apart. We genuinely don't care. And now that we're out, physically out, we really don't have any national interests in Afghanistan other than counterterrorism. And, we have sanctions against pretty much all of the current Taliban leadership. But it's not up to us to decide who gets to lead Afghanistan now. We tried to impose our will for 20 years. It didn't work. There are countries like China, for example, and Russia and India that are going to recognize the Taliban leadership diplomatically. And whether we like it or not, the Taliban are the ones who are going to appoint the Afghan ambassador to the United Nations and to every other place that has diplomatic representation. Just because we don't like it doesn't mean we get a vote. Remember, we didn't recognize the Beijing government until 1979.
That's right.
It was Jimmy Carter at the end of his term who finally recognized China, despite the fact that the Chinese Communist Party had been leading China for decades. So even though we can be behind the times on this issue, it's not up to us to make these decisions.
One last question, and you brought in China and Russia on this in 30 seconds because we do have to go. This is my own indulgence. Shane and I have been having this conversation about whether or not, or the potential for war, and the way various agencies within this government or other governments rev themselves up, seemingly, whether it's a grift or whether there's some hardliners in the various administrations that are actively saber-rattling for a larger conflict and preparing for a larger conflict. How do intelligence services function in that capacity? Meaning, what role would the CIA play in either data acquisition or, for that matter, pushing that forward or propagating one of the narratives forward? Or it doesn't necessarily play a role in that? That's more statecraft?
Well, it is statecraft. They wouldn't be responsible for pushing one line forward or the other, but they would be responsible for collecting all of the intelligence that they could possibly collect. Remember that the CIA, the likes of CIA and DIA and NSA, they are support agencies.
Yeah.
They're there to support whatever the policy is. The policy is going to come out of the White House and State Department primarily, secondarily the Defense Department, but Defense tries to stay out of these things. So the CIA is going to do what the White House tells them to do and collect whatever information they can collect to support the policy.
John, thank you for joining us, man. I really appreciate it. The voice that you
My
guys
pleasure.
are listening to, John Kiriakou. He's former CIA officer and co-host of The Backstory on Radio Sputnik, author of such books including The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. You can follow John on Twitter at John Kiriakou and learn more about him at johnkiriakou.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with Michelle Witte in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Michelle Witte. She's joining us now from Germany. Sputnik News analyst, co-host of Political Misfits, a show airing here on Radio Sputnik Monday through Friday from 12 to 2 p.m. Eastern, noon to 2 p.m. Eastern. Also follow her, by the way, on the Political Misfits Twitter, Sputnik Misfits, over at twitter.com. Michelle, thanks for joining us. How are you doing this afternoon, your time? How's it going?
I just ate a lot of potatoes.
Good to hear. Very German of you.
There's pluses and minuses, but it's doing okay. Had a lot of coffee also.
Oh, man.
Yeah. I'm afraid I can't tell you anything about the German election until, like, Christmas, guys. Sorry about that.
Is that right? It's just based on... Well, first of all, congratulations on the potatoes and coffee. A match made in heaven, if ever I heard one. Just because the potatoes, you know, you tend to get a little bit tired on potatoes. And the coffee perks you right back up. Yeah. And so you have the balancing of forces there.
Pickles. Pickles are amazing there.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
yeah, that's what I've been working on.
Months out.
The election happened, guys, at the same time as a marathon. So little bit of chaos. Not sure why they didn't think to switch the dates of those two events, but you know, it happened.
literally on the same day in Berlin on Sunday yesterday. So this is going to be, you say until Christmas, and I'm guessing not just because that's how long it's going to take to recover from the potatoes, but also because this is a long process. The vote is unclear. SDP is in the lead technically, but CDU, CSU could broker a deal with the Greens and some other party to build a coalition. What's the news on the ground there, Michelle?
I mean, that's exactly it. And that is what the candidates themselves are saying. We want to have a government by Christmas, guys. So it's not even like these are necessarily pessimistic predictions. There was a lot. I was down around the SPD headquarters last night, and there was a lot of cheering. You know, it has been a really good result for them. They were really pleased. They gained something like 5% since the last election in 2017. And they are, you know, though it's a small margin, it is still by now a clear margin, right? So they clearly defeated the CDU, Merkel's party, which had its worst showing, I think, perhaps ever. So, like, obviously, there's a difference here in perceptions of Merkel and perceptions of her party. But it still doesn't necessarily mean that the SPD is even going to be in the government. Probably they will. But, you know, right now, what the parties are trying to do is form coalitions that will give them a majority in the parliament. And you could still see a majority that is the CDU, the sort of Libertarian Free Market Party, the FDP, and the Greens. I don't know that anyone is saying that's likely, but there's a lot of power now with the Greens and the FDP who, you know, are going to be the deciding factors in what coalition ends up getting a majority of votes.
Very interesting. Has there been any talk about what takes place after Merkel? Meaning now that the Social Democrats have basically taken the majority in Parliament, I mean, barely majority, but still the majority in Parliament, and it's a 16.
Well, the majority of the vote.
Of the vote, right.
Yes.
Merkel was there for 16 years. Is there any talk about what comes after Merkel? Like, what's post-Merkel Germany look like?
I mean, they're figuring that out now. But one of the remarkable things also of this election, and a disappointing thing, according to a lot of people that I talked about, is that, you know, there are big foreign policy questions in Germany right now, right? Merkel kind of, you know, I think Merkel was pretty popular, and part of the reason she was popular, she kept things stable, but some of doing that just meant sort of kicking some cans down the road. And at some point, someone is going to have to answer these questions, including, you know, what happens with the EU going forward? What is the plan? What is the relationship with the United States? What is the relationship with Russia? What is the relationship with China? And this has all been really absent from the campaign, especially the end of the campaign. So, you know, I have been asking people, what is it, you know, from the West, we're thinking about foreign policy questions like, you know, how does Germany see its role in the world? What's the relationship with NATO going to be like? You know, all of these other questions. And people will go, I wish I knew. I wish the candidates had talked about it at all. But, you know, really what you had a campaign that was really about, you know, that ended up kind of devolving into a lot of just sort of personality stuff. And it was a bunch of personalities that people didn't even particularly like. So
various controversies, of which there were many we hear on the part of the major three parties there. But like not really getting into policy conversations. You know, in terms of the woman on the street conversations you were having with people, just talking to people, what did they have to say? You know, in terms of policy specifically, what did they want the politicians to be saying in terms of conversations? Not even a specific policy position, but what were they interested in hearing talked about that wasn't talked about?
I mean, people are, you know, the climate has become a major concern. Climate change is a major concern for voters. And, you know, ironically, I think the Greens kind of shot themselves in the foot with their response to the catastrophic flooding in Germany this summer. They were ahead in the polls, like ahead of the SPD, ahead of the CDU for a short time, and made, you know, what looking back is now an ill-advised decision to not really, I don't want to use the word use, but to not really take what happened with the flooding over the summer and say, look, this is the reason why this is our time. This is the reason why you need us and our policies. Now, maybe they didn't really have a lot of great policies to begin with, but, you know, I think that perhaps they were thinking we shouldn't politicize this or that it's too obvious. But people were really disappointed. You could see they really kind of tanked after that. And as you say, there was some controversy with Annalena Baerbock, their candidate for chancellor. But they kind of disappointed people. So obviously, the climate is a big issue on people's minds. It is not necessarily clear that they think the Greens are the only party with answers. In Berlin, there has been housing has been a huge issue. And there was a very interesting referendum passed demanding now that the Berlin legislature draft a law to expropriate hundreds of thousands of rental units from some of the largest rental companies or some of the largest companies in the country. So housing is a big issue. The SPD chancellor, has made a push for raising the minimum wage in Germany. And I think that he had some success kind of bringing his campaign message back to a sort of like, we respect workers. We want to help, your average worker. And the minimum wage in Germany is surprisingly low, I think, for Americans who think that our minimum wage is pretty substandard. I mean, he's talking about raising it to 12 euros an hour, which is not a lot.
I'm curious, how is the public, or let's say, how's the media regarding the election and the results of the election so far? Meaning, like in the United States, our media, and I know it depends upon the media, where it has certain takes based on the winners or the losers and how they support or not support various candidates and the way that they love Biden, love Hillary, hated Trump, et cetera. Is there some equivalent to that there with the candidates who are basically running and the potential for the new governments that will be formed?
I don't know if there's a love fest with any particular candidate in the media. I can tell you people I talked to hated the CDU nominee for Chancellor, Armin Laschet. Yeah. He was described to me by one woman as a snake who had just sort of accidentally gotten to his position by being in the right place at the right time. And there was even someone speculating to me that if the CDU did win with the narrow majority, they might even dump Laschet in the end because he was just so unpopular. He had this gaffe where he was seen sort of giggling in a press conference about the flooding, and that was only one thing that turned people off from him.
Very interesting. But I want to come briefly back to this. You presented, in terms of your own personal conversations, what people are focusing on, what they wish the politicians would have been talking about on the stages. You brought up climate change, housing, minimum wage, economic policies there. What has the media been focusing on? Have they been sort of succumbing to the controversies as they are so want to do? Or, have they been representing in any way, okay, these guys aren't talking about this? Have they been calling the politicians out or criticizing them in the way that you might expect them to in some cases for not hitting this stuff? What's the environment there like?
Yeah, I can't speak for the German language media. So really what I was talking to people about their responses to the candidates, and I think they were disappointed in the way the campaign has been run. But of course, the media has a role to play in what gets asked at the final debates. And people were very disappointed that there weren't more serious questions on foreign policy, for example, in the last couple of debates. So I think there's probably a sense that the media is complicit in having a campaign that has really focused on the fluffy rather than the substantive. And of course, outside of Germany, it's just sort of been all about Merkel. Yeah. All about Merkel, big shoes to fill. What does it mean that she's leaving? And I think it'll take a while before, you can kind of see around her shadow to see what has actually happened, in German politics in her wake. And it certainly hasn't been good for the CDU. There is a little bit of a sense that Merkel sort of pulled the CDU left a little bit, and now there's kind of a space open there on the right that people are sort of confused about what there will be to fill.
Interesting. Michelle, we're pretty much out of time here. When are you, you're still in Berlin, of course. When are you coming back?
I'll be back on Thursday.
Fantastic. Just real quick as we close here, any plans before you leave? Anything we should know about?
I'm going to go see some more museums. I'm going to go see all the stuff that Germany has stolen from other countries and installed in its capital.
Always valuable. and sadly, things you can only see there. Michelle Witte joining us, or Witte, as I should say. Michelle Witte joining us, covering the German elections. Thanks so much. Great conversation. She is, for those listening, Sputnik news analyst and co-host of Political Misfits. That's a show airing here on Radio Sputnik every Monday through Friday from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan Going into our break, we'll be back in a minute with headlines and the last hour of this morning's show. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the increasingly disunited surface of our globe. In the Independent Corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Alrighty, good morning everybody. It's September 27th, it's just past 9 a.m. Eastern, and it's now time for headlines. Good to talk with Michelle Whitty over there in Germany. We didn't really get to this. We might have briefly at the end of last week when we had her on, but Berlin is like a cool cultural center.
Oh, it is,
I hear.
It is.
You've been there, right?
Yeah.
Berlin
was phenomenal. I ended up, this was several years ago. My wife and I were supposed to meet. She ends up coming back home. I stayed in Berlin for maybe a week or so. There was a guy there. He was a professor of microbiology. And he found out that I was kind of there. And he was like, hey, you want to hang out? So I went to one of the plays that they were having. And then immediately after, him and I hung out at a bar till like 4 a.m, drinking and smoking cigarettes. No, it's this cultural hub. It's like this frenetic city. I loved it. I thought it was gorgeous.
Exactly. One of those places I want to go to check out, man.
Yeah.
That's a topic for another time, but I'd love to get back over there and check that out at some point. Probably will on one of these vacations coming up soon. Not to talk about that stuff too much. Let's get into our headlines. First up in COVID news, we've got about 34,200 new COVID cases reported yesterday in the United States. There were also 281 deaths reported. Over the past week, there have been an average of just under 120,000 cases per day, 119,883 cases per day. That's a decrease of 18% from the average taken 2 weeks earlier. 55% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. 64% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. And as of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 42,905,000 people across the United States. It has killed 688,157 people, meanwhile. In national political news, under the Trump administration, the CIA floated kidnapping and or killing Julian Assange while he was being housed in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Yahoo News reports that the actions being considered were part of a larger plan to surveil Assange and WikiLeaks associates, sow discord within the organization, and steal electronic devices from people involved in work with WikiLeaks. The report is that the CIA's leadership, including Mike Pompeo, sought revenge for the release of Vault 7. That was a major release by WikiLeaks, including hacking tools used by the CIA. That release led Pompeo to publicly classify WikiLeaks as a non-state hostile intelligence service, quote unquote, a designation which significantly broadened the scope of what would be considered a reasonable response. And we had a great conversation, by the way, speaking about this earlier on in the show with John Kiriakou. Go back and check that out if this is your thing, and frankly, it should be your thing. That was from about 8:15 to about 8:45 the last hour, although we focused on the Assange bit from about 8:15 to about 8:35, call it, for about a solid 20 minutes there before moving on to talking about other stuff. Great conversation. He was able to go into all this stuff in, not just with knowledge, but like with personal experience, people that he knew who were able to describe this. And he raised the question, a very valid one. Okay, we're part of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing agreement. It's, an 80-year-old agreement founded literally, I think, 80 years ago this year, something like that. About 1941 it was founded anyway. Old intelligence sharing agreement between 5 Anglophone nations. You have the United States, the United Kingdom, you have Canada, you have Australia, and New Zealand. Australia, one of the parties to that agreement, would have to sign off on this, according to John. If we wanted to assassinate Julian Assange, he's an Australian citizen.
Because we're not supposed to hide information, supposedly. At least that's... By the way, I don't know if I believe that. I don't believe for a moment that countries don't have secrets even amongst their allies. But under the idea, it's supposed to be, they're supposed to know.
Under the idea that it's supposed to be. But think about any way the story goes. Think about this for a second. Say we're supposed to check with them and we don't. And we go forward. That's a huge scandal.
Yes.
Say killing a citizen of one of our allied countries. Yeah. You get my point.
Yeah.
But say they do sign off on it, or most likely,
still a huge problem.
Say they don't. What do we do with that? There's all these unasked and therefore unanswered questions. Super fascinated to get into this stuff to whatever extent we can. Sadly, it has to do with the CIA, so we might not be able to get into it for like 80 years from now.
Yeah, but I'm glad John brought that up. That's a really good point, though.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, if they know about it, it's against their laws to basically allow one of the countries to whack Assange. If they don't know about it, you still have all sorts of problems because we're killing a journalist from one of our member countries. I mean, that's problematic any way you cut it.
Yeah.
Wow.
Absolutely. Let's keep on going here. Also in national political news, back here in the States, the recent salmonella outbreak in America has reached 279 reported cases, 8 hospitalizations. Cases have stretched across 29 different states so far. Samples from restaurants in hotspot areas have detected salmonella in a condiment cup containing onion, cilantro, and lime. It is impossible to tell which of these foods were tainted with the bacteria, although last I saw, cilantro was the one most under suspicion of being the host vegetable, so to speak, which, along with E. coli, shows that vegans are evil for forcing us to eat only plants. They'll get us sick with salmonella and E. coli. And I'm just kidding. I actually like vegans quite a bit. I used to be a vegan.
Did you?
But just briefly. But no, I'm just making a joke there, of course. But do we really need another disease spreading in the United States right now?
No, we do not.
This one is so small. Here's the thing: we're reporting this 279 cases. How many COVID cases did we report this morning? 34,200, and that was for the weekend. An extremely slow day. In other words, the disease we already have. I don't think I need another disease in my life right now, Jamarl.
No, I don't think any of us need another disease in our life.
I'm just being frank here. I'm just saying the controversial things. Anyway, let's keep going. The FBI is opening an investigation into officers involved in a suspected takedown after a police dog, suspect takedown, after a police dog was allowed to bite the suspect repeatedly. Officers in Woodson Terrace, that's in Montana, were called when a man had broken into a business. He was confronted, appeared to be on drugs, and he threatened officers. He was warned that the dog was released, and then cell phone footage shows the canine handler allowing the dog to bite the man for about 30 seconds. He attempted to get up, stumbled, and the dog engaged the other leg for another 30 seconds. Woodson Terrace is fully cooperating with the federal probe. This is one of those cases, maybe we can come back to it. Don't want to delay headlines too long. But another case with a cell phone. Abortion clinics in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, are reporting at least 2/3 of their patients are coming from Texas, with the most restrictive abortion laws in the country recently sworn into state legislation. Texas residents must go elsewhere when seeking an abortion. Prices for these procedures are going up, along with waiting times. In international news, in yesterday's German elections, the center-left SDP has won a narrow victory. SPD, gosh, I keep getting there. SPD has won a narrow victory, taking just under 26% of the vote. That leaves the CDU, CSU, with just over 24% of the vote, and the Greens just under 15%. Meanwhile, FDP, sort of more libertarian-leaning right-wing party, about 11.5% of the second vote. And I'll stop there. There are other parties behind, including, AFD, 10.3%. That's like the sort of far-right anti-immigration one that kind of changed purposes. Anyway, they're over 10%. But broadly, what's the situation right now? Even though the SPD is out in the lead with 25.7%, this is a fractured political system where, of course, they need to build coalitions. Those coalitions could push the SPD out of that lead. Yeah. They might, the CDU, CSU, if they go with the Greens and the FDP, I don't know what I did there. If they go with the FDP, then they don't need this SPD. And so it's, for American audiences, it might be counterintuitive that the party in the lead might not be a part of the government in terms of selecting the chancellor and being really in charge of, in terms of calling the shots. It's just interesting.
Yeah, it is. They make coalitions. It's not one party by itself, But yeah,
exactly. Carrying on, the U.S. is calling on Iran to allow American watchdogs to access a workshop at the Tessa Courage complex and to reinstall cameras has agreed. If they fail to do so, the U.S. stated they will consult with other board members of the International Atomic Energy Agency and respond appropriately. It's a damn shame. I wanted to hit this story with John. We just didn't get to it.
Yeah.
Damn shame. The Taliban have petitioned the rest of the world to resume international flights in and out of Afghanistan. This comes as the vast majority of foreigners left the country during the Taliban takeover. Shopkeepers cannot move their products there. The Taliban seems to be inviting the rest of the world to treat and trade with them as they would with any other country. A shortage of truck drivers has resulted in a disruption in the supply chain for UK gas stations, or as they like to call them, petrol pumps. Panic buying has contributed to the worsening of this problem, as for the fourth day in a row, stations are having gas lines. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is considering sending in the army to deliver fuel to the stations, hopefully relieving the shortage. In Earth and Science news, as the Space Race 2.0 ramps up, NASA, like many other occupations in this country, needs more employees. Specifically, they need astronauts. A clever solution to get more astronauts is apparently to release an augmented reality graphic novel. The comic follows the story of the fictional Callie Rodriguez as she becomes the first woman on the moon. By pointing your phone at special XR codes within the story, those are augmented reality codes, the story will allow you to tour the Orion spacecraft, play video games or games inside of games, watch videos, exciting, and earn badges. And again, maybe something else to come back to if we've got time for it. In business news, Facebook is rebutting a report put out by the Wall Street Journal claiming that Instagram was a toxic app for the company. They stated that those dealing with body issues could make their feelings worse. However, those coping with loneliness, anxiety, sadness, and eating issues said the app helped them in their difficult moments. A poll shows 32% of teen girls said that when they felt bad about their bodies, Instagram made them feel worse. And the Wall Street Journal found that for 13% of British teens and 6% of Americans, they traced suicidal thoughts back to Instagram. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. The thing is, we had this conversation earlier. It's like it's a trap, Jamarl. I keep coming back to this just because it's an interesting
Instagram one. Yeah,
Instagram one. But one other point to get out is that when people respond this way to Instagram, they're not just responding to Instagram, they're just responding to people.
Right.
It's just people behaving in certain ways that they would feel maybe similarly bad about if they were exposed to them in real life. And what's the alternative? Just don't expose them to people who are going to be self-aggrandizing and put a lot of whatever on.
I mean, it's just a social media platform. People put their pictures and they put their stories up.
Yes.
No more, no less. There's no magic, right? And it's like that individual, this has everything to do with the individual. This is not an outside thing, if that makes sense. Meaning it's not an Instagram thing. It's a person thing. They're taking issue with the way people are living their lives in the sense of their own insecurities.
Now, I say that, but then I want to play the devil's advocate. On the other hand, Instagram, like any, social media app these days, it incentivizes certain things.
Of course.
It incentivizes people to, what's the incentive for somebody to, well, for one thing,
nobody's going to put the worst image of themselves.
You can't face-tune your face in reality.
Right.
But if you could, people would do it. But would they have as much of an incentive to? It's not like walking around, you're getting 100 million likes. You just look good and you feel good and you like how people look at you. And maybe if you're flirting with somebody or whatever, you're going to come across more attractively. But with Instagram, you can be just gaming the system. You can be just doing it for purely monetary reasons.
You could.
Where you're pumping up your attributes in these certain ways. Yeah. It's compelling you to act. So there's another case there. There's another side to it too.
I guess my thing is the incentives though are built in looking good. Like nobody wants to look bad, whether that's in real life or whether that's on Instagram. Instagram just gives you many more tools to kind of up that.
Absolutely.
It doesn't have to be real even.
I want to go back to the police dog confrontation briefly.
Yeah, that's horrendous. I've seen videos like this where the person is down and the cops let the dog off anyway to go after the person. These are horrible cases. That should not be allowed.
Maybe on the one hand, I'm not a fan of getting bit by angry dogs, but on the other hand, do we know how hurt this person actually got? We're seeing, this news is based on a cell phone story. Austin is going into action mode. Thank you. I appreciate it. My point being, okay, so you're immobilized by a dog who has its large mouth wrapped around your leg, pinning you to the ground. That seems like a pretty effective mobilization, a way to immobilize somebody. If you get hurt, if there are deep tooth marks and you get a gangrene infection or something like that, that's when it starts to get really bad. But like, as a way of being immobilized, what is the actual alternative here? Do you want another Derek Chauvin improperly doing something?
So wait, the only two options are having a dog chew on you for a minute or Derek Chauvin?
Of course not. But let's go through them. What are the ways to immobilize somebody?
Well, there's the stun gun. There's physically. There's pretty sure you can put a bullet in them. I guess my thing is
that sounds bad.
That sounds bad.
And the stun gun doesn't quite work.
But the two things that you posited was Derek Chauvin or having a dog eat you for a minute.
Of course.
And I'm saying that neither one of those things are all that great.
Of course. No, of course. Well, maybe, but here's the thing. In a choice between many evils, there is going to be a least evil, presumably, and that thing is still going to seem evil. So what do we do about it?
Well, I would say not have a dog chew on somebody's leg for a minute if they don't have to chew on a dog's leg on a person's leg. I would at the very least start there. I mean, look, I need to see the case in and of itself. But I've seen cases where they let the dog off on the person to go after the person. And, it's oftentimes it's unnecessary. I mean, I would prefer to get stunned as opposed to be chewed on by an animal. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been bitten by a dog. It's not necessarily a pleasant experience.
I have.
Especially in a situation where you have these canine dogs that are trained to maul. And the cop just lets the dog maul the person. The question becomes, did the person need, or did the cop need to do it? That's always the question. Whether the person gets shot, whether the person gets tased, whether the person gets beat up. It always boils down to, did the cop have to do what they did in that particular moment, and was there another option? And look, I have a hard time believing that there wasn't another option. And again, I would rather be tased than be chewed on. I mean, the chewed on thing is just rough. I mean, Austin is probably going to give us the thing on how bad the guy was injured. And if he was injured at all, there might be superficial wounds or it might just be wounds. But I got to be honest, the eating a person alive.
But that's the thing. You're making it super hyperbolic there. If there was literally, and I'm just making this up, but let's say for a second that the dude wasn't seriously hurt. He's just making a lot of noise because it's shocking that you're getting bit by an animal, but he's not hurt. The dog's just basically pinning him down. That seems.
What do you consider hurt? You're trying to subvert it. You think I'm being hyperbolic. I think you're trying to undermine it.
Well, no.
What's here's hurt means in this case?
You asked me a question. Clearly, there's a gradient, but being eaten alive, I'm saying, is like the farthest end of the spectrum. You said that's the phrase that you used.
Oh, fair enough.
That's at the extreme.
He's not being eaten alive.
He's not being eaten alive. And so
he's being mauled. He's not being eaten alive.
My point is, it's easy to sort of feel the worst. But I don't know, man. If you had, I would rather have a mild version of this done to me than get stunned. Just because that sounds terrifying. I don't want to get shocked. I don't want somebody to immobilize me by sending electricity zapping through my system. Maybe I wouldn't prefer the Chauvin treatment for sure, but maybe I might even prefer being immobilized by just some officer who's doing it in the right way.
Yeah.
I would calm the F down, hopefully, assuming I'm not on something that's making me not calm down. I'd calm down. I'd be like, Yeah,
you wouldn't have to do this to me. I mean,
maybe?
Because to me, it's like, all right, I can't get out of this situation. I'm not going to win this fight.
But I'll put it like this. They're putting a dog's life in danger, which is sad. But isn't that better than putting a human's life? I'll put it like this. If a cop, somebody's on whatever, say the dude's on crystal, say the dude's on PCP, say he's on something that's making him act very much a particular way. He's violent, he's aggressive, he can't be reasoned with, that kind of thing. Do you want to send a cop in to immobilize that dude? Do you want to rely on a stun gun that might not be able to do anything? Or do you want to send an angry, menacing dog that barks a lot and bites a bit to freak the person out and to get them to shut down, to send their amygdala, their lizard brain or whatever, into shutdown mode and from fight into flight, basically? That might be what happened here. I don't know.
If the guy's tweaking out, oh, by the way, it's also in Missouri. There was a
typo in the headline. Thanks for that. What's in Terrace, Missouri?
If the guy's tweaking out, it's sending a dog in. I don't necessarily know if that's going to be the thing that shuts his brain down. I don't know, man. I don't like this notion of having dogs basically chew on people if they don't have to be chewed on.
I don't like any of this stuff, but what do you do with it?
I put it this way. The question always boils down to, did the cop have to respond in the way that the cop responded? And if is there a way out without having the person shot, tased, beat up, etc.? And if the answer is yes, then that's a different conversation that we're having. If we're talking about somebody who's tweaked out on something, then I would imagine there's not a situation where in every case somebody's tweaking out, there's a canine unit nearby.
How do they
deal with those people then?
Are we going to put this dog on trial? Or are we just going to put this dog down?
It's not the dog's fault.
Well, okay. So,
it's the owner's fault.
The thing is, we're a little bit over time now. but it's an interesting conversation, and I think we'll have time to come back to it too towards the later end of this hour. But it's just interesting. I don't know. It touches on interesting things. And then there's the whole question of like, should we be focusing this much on police violence, or should we use police violence as a way to talk about race? And then should we use race as a way to talk about class? Because if that's the natural, like police violence talking about race, that was last summer. What didn't happen, what didn't materialize, was using the race conversation to talk seriously about issues of class, which
I tried.
Is correlated with race. You did try. Your credit.
I tried hard.
But there are different angles on this one. Anyway, you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back, we'll be speaking with Misty Winston on the plot to murder Julian Assange. This revelation published by Yahoo News, Michael Isikoff, and a couple of other authors. Michael Isikoff, we might want to talk briefly about who he is at some point. Not necessarily with Misty, but later on in this hour. He was involved early stages of Russiagate. I could go into it. Just other sides of this. But regardless, we're going to be coming back with Misty Winston, Sarcasm Stardust, as she's known on Twitter, to talk about the plot to murder Julian Assange and yesterday's story on this. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with Misty on the other side of this short break. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Hi, I'm political analyst Garland Nixon.
And I'm political scientist, author, and nationally syndicated columnist Dr. Wilmer Leon.
We're the co-hosts for The Critical Hour, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time here on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C.
We close out your day with a thorough and hard-hitting analysis of the day's top stories, where we bring in brilliant scholars, authors, and investigative journalists from around the world.
And on Fridays, it's panel time, when we do a roundup of the week's most important issues.
Join us to keep up with the world's top stories.
Enjoy an in-depth analysis.
And have a little fun along the way. Listen to our show,
The Critical Hour, Monday through Fridays on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So we've been having this conversation on the bombshell report that came out over the weekend by Yahoo News, with basically the CIA and the top level of the Trump administration trying to find a way to either murder or rendition Julian Assange. We had a great conversation earlier with John Kiriakou, who gave his personal experience working in the CIA and how all of this stuff broke down. But what it basically boiled down to was the release of Vault 7 embarrassed the CIA by putting out a huge amount of information on the hacking tools and the procedures that they had at their steed in order to use around the world. They also went as far as trying to get certain elements of the press, Glenn Greenwald, for example, as not media, but some kind of foreign actor or some kind of news warrior or something. Basically, they were trying to find ways of categorizing either WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, or members of the press in ways where they could treat them as something other than the press. To have a conversation about the Julian Assange issue, we're joined with Misty Winston. Misty Winston is a political activist, organizer, and co-host of both the Facts on the Ground podcast and the hashtag Free Assange Vigils. Misty, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me back. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So one of the interesting things that came, that was in his document, I mean, to be honest, there's a lot of interesting topics in this document. But one of the interesting ones, even though they're talking about Trump right now in this context, it makes it clear that this preceded Pompeo's arrival to Langley, meaning it preceded Pompeo joining the CIA, which means it was also within the Obama administration where they were considering these type of high-level meetings of either murder or rendition. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, because basically Assange, for the longest time, part of the reason he even went into the embassy the first time around was he knew that there were charges that were floating behind this kind of, ginned up charge of sexual harassment or sexual assault. And his point was, look, these guys are going to try to rendition me back to the United States or extradite me back to the United States. Now, at the time, media was like, oh, he's just making that up. Oh, he's being hyperbolic and paranoid.
He's paranoid.
He's just paranoid. And lo and behold, not paranoid at all. He knew exactly what he was talking about. That is exactly what they were trying to do, even going so far as to blow off asylum claims by Ecuador. It's astonishing stuff. What is your take on this?
Well, this is very clearly a bipartisan effort to, go after Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And like you mentioned, other journalists across the globe. This really doesn't stop. I mean, we've been saying this in Assange activism the whole time, that this doesn't end with Assange. And you're right. This definitely does precede Trump. It does precede Mike Pompeo. They were definitely the, more willing to go further in their actions for sure. But, I think it really started with when he aided Edward Snowden and seeking safety and getting to Russia. I mean, that's not where he was initially intended to go, but he did. Julian Assange was very instrumental in getting Snowden to safety. And I think that was really when the United States government and the quote unquote deep state, whatever you want to call them, I think that's when they really changed the way that they viewed WikiLeaks and Julian Assange and the threat level that they posed to them.
That was the critical shift, because Snowden was like a major story there for a while. And maybe practically they saw, okay, there's this weird new organization doing a weird new kind of thing where they're acting, they're journalists, but they're doing something that most journalists simply can't. They don't have this sort of large base of operations. They can't, seamlessly connect people who are trying to leak information with people who are willing to spread it necessarily. And there's always the threat going into one of these situations as a whistleblower that the journalist turns on you, they burn you, they decide to throw you back to the hounds effectively, and you're silenced forever. WikiLeaks was like a new way of preventing that kind of thing from happening. And that's why they were so threatening. And then Snowden hits, the story I mean, not the person. Snowden hits these major sort of earth-shaking revelations for Western audiences about how the U.S. and the U.K., major governments, were spying on basically everybody, was the feeling. And of course, technically not, but the feeling was all of us are at the mercy of these huge institutions who don't have our best interest at heart, who overreact and probably do some very shady stuff. And that broke, right? That was the big thing, and that's why you're saying that, Misty.
Yes, I think that's definitely when they started viewing Julian Assange. I mean, they already knew that he was, after the Chelsea Manning leaks in 2010, they were already, seen as this kind of revolutionary new publishing organization, because there is no question that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks revolutionized journalism. Every major outlet now uses the secure Dropbox, and that was, all WikiLeaks. So they definitely changed the way journalism was done. And I think that the United States definitely saw them as a threat already. But then once Julian Assange stepped in to help Edward Snowden, and really that was like this kind of revolutionary source protection as well. And Snowden wasn't Julian Assange's source. That was Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras. But, Julian Assange stepped in to help get him, to a safe country and out of the hands of the United States government. And I think that was when the mindset shifted in the United States on what Julian Assange meant.
And, right here, it says, is WikiLeaks a journalistic outlet? Are Poitiers, or as Laura and Glenn, truly journalists, the former official said. We tried to change the definition of them, and I preached this to the White House and got rejected. And then as it goes on, they tried to make this argument that WikiLeaks was some kind of spy service. And by being a spy service, any action against them would basically be counterintelligence.
And that's really the really troubling aspect. There's a lot of troubling aspects of this story, but the fact that they were able, most people may remember Mike Pompeo's very first speech that he gave was essentially dedicated to WikiLeaks, and he labeled them as a hostile for non-state intelligence agency. And so that by using that designation, that was really just a signal that because in most cases you would have to have, there's like a whole process if you want to interfere in an organization like WikiLeaks. The president has to sign off, the House and the Senate have to be involved. But if you can, label them as, some sort of a terrorist threat or a spy agency, then you don't need as much approval. And anything that you do is just offensive counterintelligence, and it's okay to do, and that's fine. And so they were able to, do all kinds of what they call disruption techniques, whether it was stealing electronic devices or infiltrating WikiLeaks from the inside, trying to cause dissension within the ranks there. They were able to do all of these things without any approval from, higher up in the government. So
I just read it. It says, at the CIA, the new designation meant Assange and WikiLeaks will go from a target of collection to a target of disruption, said former senior CIA official. Proposals began percolating upwards within the CIA and NSC to undertake various disruptive activities. The core of, quote, offensive counterintelligence, unquote, against WikiLeaks. These included paralyzing its digital structure or infrastructure, disrupting its communications, provoking internal disputes within the organization by planting damaging information, and stealing WikiLeaks members' electronic devices, according to 3 officials. That is extraordinary.
yes. And I mean, this really is, it just speaks to the level that they will go to in order to silence Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. I mean, Mike Pompeo, the Vault 7 releases, that was a monumental embarrassment to Mike Pompeo to have that happen on his watch. And for those who don't know what the Vault 7 releases are, that's the largest CIA leak in history. And it was, hugely embarrassing for them. And I think that we should also mention, too, that Julian Assange, when he released Vault 7, was years into arbitrary detention in the Ecuadorian embassy. He already knew that he was enemy number 1 of the national security state, and he published it anyway. And to me, that just speaks to his level of courage, first of all, and just the seriousness in which he takes his work. He knew that that was going to make him an even bigger target, and he did it anyway, which I think is really important to mention.
Maybe definitely worth revisiting this briefly. How is Assange currently doing? We've had you on pretty often to talk about this when there have been updates from the courts. It seems like contact with the outside is limited. And of course, as always, his mental health, not in a good place. Been held in captivity in various ways, whether technically voluntarily or not, for like years now. It feels like over a decade, even though it definitely isn't. But Misty, how is he doing? What's the latest on Julian Assange's state?
He's not doing great. I'm sure people can imagine that being held in essentially solitary confinement for 2.5 years is not good for a person's mental health. So he's not doing great. He was unable to see his partner or his children for months due to the COVID lockdown. And even when he was able to see his children, he wasn't able to hold them due to the restrictions that they were doing for the COVID stuff. So he is in I'm not going to sugarcoat it. He's not in a great place. And he doesn't have a next court date until October 27th and 28th. And this is essentially just going to be like we're going to be going over all of the same stuff again because the United States is appealing the no extradition ruling from Judge Vanessa Baritzer from January. So to me, it seems like we shouldn't even make it that far. After this report has come out, after the UC Global report came out showing that, he was being spied on in the Ecuadorian embassy and that the CIA was involved in that as well. After the Siggy Thordarson story came out where the key witness has been, who admitted to fabricating his testimony in exchange for immunity from the FBI. All of these stories have come out in the past, several months. And to me, it completely destroys their case against Julian Assange. And the fact that it's continuing is mind-boggling to me.
And here's another case. I mean, the reason that Baritzer held Assange from extradition, at least nominally, was that he was a suicide risk because he was autistic, which has always been a weird argument. But specifically in American jails, the condition of American jails is so bad. Basically, there was a danger to the life of Julian Assange by his own hand, in her words, which makes it all the weirder. But this story says the CIA was talking about killing the guy. That's a much more palpable danger to his life. Illegal as far as I can tell, although I'm guessing that some people are going to argue that one on the higher levels. Is it illegal if he's actually working for a non-state foreign intelligence service, whatever that means or looks like? Do you see that factoring into, do you see any early conversation legally following the release of this, breaking story basically from Yahoo News yesterday? Do you see any conversation propping its head up over in the UK legal establishment about this, Misty?
I haven't seen any yet. And again, I don't know. This case is so completely ridiculous and irregular. There's nothing about it that has been predictable. So I don't know that there's even going to be discussion about it. To me, this case should have been dropped. It shouldn't have even been a case to begin with. He should have never been arrested. But certainly after all of these other stories have come out in the UC Global case and all, the fact that it's continuing is just, I don't even know what to expect anymore. I don't know how they can argue it legally. In the report, it very clearly says that once again, they have been unable to link Julian Assange and WikiLeaks to Russia. That's why Mike Pompeo had to use the terminology that he did, because they couldn't link him to Russia. So they had to kind of reimagine what WikiLeaks was and give them like a definition that would allow them to do the things that they wanted to do in order to infiltrate the organization. So, there's no ties to any sort of foreign spy agencies or anything like that. They are just a publishing organization. So I haven't heard anything from the UK legal system yet. I haven't heard any rumblings. It's still very early. The story just dropped yesterday. So hopefully, we'll have some intelligence moving forward where we'll look at this. And to me, it's a very objective thing. This should be dropped. It should have been dropped a long time ago. And so, hopefully, we can use this to push for the release of Julian Assange.
Missy, explain for whatever journalists or whatever, I guess, TV personalities or even media personalities, the risk of all of this, meaning the fact that they're going after Assange, who's basically a journalist, all of them are at risk under this model. And not just all of them are at risk. I mean, they're basically changing definitions in order to create a justification to go after somebody. It's like Bush saying,
somebody.
Yeah, basically, it's not torture. It's interrogation, it's that nonsense.
Yes.
Yeah, and using the language as a way of getting around basic laws or whatever. I mean, it puts all of us at risk, correct?
It really, really, really does. And I cannot stress that enough. In the article, it mentions that they tried to label Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras as, quote, information brokers. So they're no longer journalists, which means they no longer have First Amendment protections. And that's going to happen across the board. Like I said at the beginning of our segment, this does not end with Julian Assange in any way. They are going to use this. I've said this on your show before. The United States is seeking global jurisdiction over information and journalism. And that is as clear cut as I can put it for you. This is the United States trying to garner all control over every aspect of journalism across the globe. And that should really terrify everybody. This is a really, really big deal. I don't know how to get that across to people so that they will care. It's really just depressing that we don't have more mainstream coverage and that we don't have more discussions about what's happening, because this really is the future of press freedom. It really is the future of the First Amendment on the line. So this is something that people need to be talking about. This is something, I know that they've managed to demonize Julian Assange and create this kind of comic book villain out of him through a decade-long propaganda campaign. But people need to see past their biases and understand that this is a really dangerous thing that's happening, and it's coming for all of us. I know that sounds very dramatic, but that's reality.
Well, the idea being that we're all going to have to live under effectively an authoritarian state when it comes to controlling information, which is the main way that democracy is supposed to work. I'm reminded, I keep coming back to the Chomsky quote, which I think I'm paraphrasing every time I say it. Basically, a cudgel is to the totalitarian state what propaganda is to a democratic one. Basically, the way that you control a democracy or a democratic republic, whatever, but really a democracy, is by controlling what people are allowed to say to each other, which effectively controls what they're able to think. And by vilifying through extrajudicial processes, illegally is really what I'm saying, by vilifying, potentially killing people who are a threat to that state, it's the national security establishment taking the reins and holding on to them as tightly as it possibly can, taking the reins of information, taking the reins of what people are allowed to say, what they're ultimately allowed to come to realize about the world that they live in. It is huge. Now, what makes it a little bit weird is that there are a lot of people who have been very rightly saying this kind of thing for like decades at this point. But specifically, let's stick to the most relevant period, for years. When it comes to Assange, when it comes to Snowden, that was why those disclosures were such a shock. And what was interesting about them was that they actually got pretty popular. They broke through. The whole Snowden revelations broke through into the media sphere. There was a public, I don't know if panic is the right word, but there was a serious response from the public where people got more interested in, okay, how do I protect myself? Whether it's covering the webcams on their computers with Post-it notes, which is one end of it, or just being cautious about the kinds of things that they're saying online, realizing that whether it's public or private, it's being watched. That whole thing, it's had this massive chilling effect. And I think a lot of people in our society have taken it to heart. Yet people have been talking about this for years now. Misty, practically, what you're doing and what a lot of the people involved with the Assange case are doing is, of course, personally sort of lobbying the public, lobbying the media, try to make them aware. This is a big thing that we should all be paying attention to end this right now. But he is one person. And saving this one person, while it is certainly a good test that we can get people out of the situation that the international security establishment is able to put them into, it's not enough. at all. And
No.
everybody who's
Well, it's not
involved
just
in it.
about the one person, though. I'm really glad that you bring that up, because so often the Assange movement gets criticized for being too Assange-centric, which I'm willing to take that criticism on, and I agree with you. It's not about Julian Assange, though. What they're trying to do, if extraditing Julian Assange is able to go through, that will set a legal and historical precedent moving forward, and that's something that will be almost impossible to come back from. Once you give those rights away, they're very difficult to get back. And so, yes, it is not just about Julian Assange. Saving his life is absolutely worth fighting for, and it is absolutely, a worthwhile, venture to go through. But it really is so much bigger than just Julian Assange. Stella Morris, his partner, has been very clear about this. Julian himself knows very much that it's not just about him. And that's why, instead of just letting it go with just the mental health stuff, that they were trying to fight back against all of the other points of the extradition hearing that Judge Vanessa Baraitser ruled in favor of the United States, because that was all of the things that was attack on the First Amendment. So, we all need to be very clear that, yes, Julian Assange's life is 100% worth saving. He should not be in the position he's in. He's being tortured to death slowly. We're watching a slow motion execution, but it is so much bigger than that. It really is so much bigger than that. This is the future of press freedom. It's the future of journalism as we know it. And once we lose that, it's going to be incredibly difficult to get that back.
John Kiriakou made a phenomenal point, is basically saying the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, UK, are part of this kind of Five Eyes allegiance or alliance, where the countries basically exchange information with one another. And so even though the United States supposedly aren't supposed to spy on our citizens, well, we're working with Australia, who can spy on U.S. citizens, that type of stuff, the shell game. In order to be able to do this, and for this level of high-level talks about basically murdering Assange or renditioning Assange, did Australia know? Meaning, did the government know that the United States was planning this going back to Obama and under the Trump and the levels to which this got to? And if they,
it's really difficult for me to think that they did not know.
But that's the
really hard for me to. That's a hard pill to swallow.
Because that's against their own laws, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, has there been any more talk at all, or any kind of conversation about Australia intervening in regards to the affairs of Julian Assange, or Australia is just
there's
out
regular
of the conversation
about that. The Australian Free Assange movement has done wonderful work trying to get different members of their government to speak out. They have a kind of a contingent of, I think it's like a dozen or 15 different people that have been speaking out for Julian Assange. But yes, there's been constant conversation about getting Australia to step in and stand up for their own citizen. But I think that Australia has very much been, Caitlin Johnstone, who's a good friend of mine, calls them the United States basement gimp. And so, they just do whatever they're told. The United States is kind of running the show. It's the same way with the UK. I mean, in the report that Michael Isikoff and others just released, they were talking about shootouts in the streets of London, and the UK was like, yeah, we'll do that. So it's just basically these, whatever the United States wants, the United States gets. And so there has been talk of Australia, stepping up their game. There's also been talks about investigations into finding out what they knew and when, because that's something that we need to be talking about. There's other governments that need to be investigated. There were WikiLeaks affiliates who had, their houses broken into, their stuff stolen. And there's a German, Balthasar Garzon, what did Germany know? So there's definitely a lot of conversations that we need to have moving forward after this report came out. There's a lot of moving parts to this, but I think first and foremost, Julian Assange needs to be released immediately.
And Misty, I want to close here. Where would you recommend people go? What would you recommend people pay attention to on those conversations? Where are those conversations happening in terms of, in public places that people should be checking out?
So, I mean, obviously you can just, if you go on Twitter and just, hashtag free Assange, you're going to find a multitude of conversations there. You can go to Shadowproof, which Kevin Gostola runs. He's been doing amazing coverage of Julian Assange and other whistleblowers. If you're interested in following the cases of people like Daniel Hale or Joshua Schultz. You can also go, the Gray Zone does amazing work. Max Blumenthal did a report last year about the journalists that were being spied on in the Ecuadorian embassy when they were visiting Julian Assange. We have our Action for Assange website. We have a multitude of calls to action that you can participate. It's actionforassange.com. So we have a bunch of different things, different phone numbers you can call, emails, but really the biggest thing that people can do is educate yourself to the best that you can. And I understand that the Assange case is very complex and it's, difficult to kind of get your head around all of the moving parts. but educate yourself, in general, and just talk to people, because in the United States, there is very little coverage of the Julian Assange case. So that's the media blackout is our biggest, hurdle that we have to overcome, just getting legitimate information to people, because once people see the reality of the Assange case, it's very easy to show them what a just ridiculous nightmare this is and how dangerous it is to all of us. So, just really having conversations with people, talking about it. We're going to do a big push on Twitter today, trying to drag some, get some attention onto the case and onto this new report. So if anybody wants to participate in that, I'll be on Twitter all day, and just come help us out.
That's awesome. That sounds great. Misty Winston, thank you for joining us this morning. Great talking.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Appreciate you. Misty Winston is a political activist, organizer, and co-host of both the Facts on the Ground podcast and Free Assange Vigils. Follow Misty on Twitter at Sarcasm Stardust, and check out the Facts on the Ground podcast on YouTube and on Twitter at FOTG Podcast. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back, we're taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. We're also talking headlines. And again, taking your calls, 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back on the other side of this short break. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. 202-521-1320 is the phone number you should be calling if you want to be calling us. We've got callers on the line, but again, just holding the door open for you. 202-521-1320. We have Tarif calling in from New Orleans, talking about Assange and a Lebanese leader meeting with Putin to put troops in Syria. This is also, by the way, after Erdogan told the U.S. that he wants us to remove our troops from Syria. Big news too. Tarif, what's on your mind this morning?
Thank you for taking my call. I have 3 comments. Maybe I can get to the third one. Okay, first, free Julian Assange, free Dan Zerger, and hands off Haiti. The first one dealing with Julian Assange. As you all know that when Julian Assange got leaked documents, he would white out names, black out names, right? So these agents or political figures won't get in trouble. Just imagine if some other news agencies or different countries get sensitive documents and they start leaking out things, right, without writing out names, blacking out the names, and, basically getting people in trouble or whatnot. So I think it's on the Biden administration. I think it should behoove the Justice Department and the Biden administration to drop the charges on Julian Assange, because they will have leaked documents, as you can see, dealing with that over the weekend what happened. So I think it's best to drop the charges, let that man walk free, and let him do his job to keep on telling the truth.
And Tarif, just to back up something you're saying, I mean, there were reports that Julian Assange was working with, the Washington FBI, John Warner, if I'm not mistaken, was one of the people, to basically, like you said, scrub names out of the documents in order to keep those agents safe. Trust broke down when it became clear that the Justice Department wasn't basically going to assist and follow through. I mean, they basically put the kibosh on it, in which case the information started to get released. But as a basic premise, yeah, he was willing to scrub some of the names of the agents out to keep those agents safe. Totally correct.
Yeah, well, we'll see what they're going to do. They need to release the man. My second comment is this. I was watching over the weekend. I came across Hassan Nasrallah, the Lebanese spiritual leader. He was talking about General Salami and how that dude was so much a key figure in that region, in Eurasia and whatnot. It was ridiculous. He actually went some years ago to Moscow, the general, and spoke with Putin, one-on-one.
Wait, Tarif, you said Salami, but you're talking about Soleimani, right? Qasem Soleimani?
Soleimani. Yeah, Soleimani. I'm sorry. I'm gonna have
a lot less delicious.
Hey.
You distracted me there for a second with thoughts of the delicious cured meat salami. No, Tarif, I'm sorry. I don't mean to mock. What were you saying there?
Well, I found out that when I was listening to that Nasrallah speaking, he was talking to a journalist, and he basically was saying that the general went to Moscow and he spoke to Putin. And he sat down, he talked to him, as men, and it was rational with him. He had a game plan. He laid up a map of the goals, the objectives that what could be accomplished in saving the Syrian government and stopping the Islamic terrorists from taking over it. And he didn't go there like saying, please, Mr. Putin, please. He didn't go like that. That's what Nasrallah was saying. He didn't go like getting on his knees or using some type of rhetoric or whatever, begging. But he went out showing, look, as a lawyer, like, hey, this is case. The Syria needs your help. Can you please send in the troops? And, we're, sending our people too to fight off these Islamic terrorists that's killing people. And the way he did it, he convinced Putin so much that Putin decided to bring in, let the troops go there. You know what I'm saying? So I didn't know that. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
I didn't know that dude was that much of a key. I know he's a key figure, but I didn't know he actually talked one-on-one with Putin. Who knew that?
For some reason, I feel like I did know that. But I know that he was acting as an intermediary. I know that he was acting kind of as a diplomat. But we talked about this a while back. And it was a little bit controversial because, of course, you have Iran and Russia talking together about troops in Syria, and we're in Syria too. They're our enemies, and they're working together. It sounds nefarious, that kind of thing. We were talking about this a while back, but you might be right, and it might be new to me looking back on it that Soleimani himself was the guy to go there and negotiate this stuff or talk about it. It's just interesting. And again, worth pointing out, Erdogan asking the U.S. to pull out of Syria because, of course, he has a lot of interest in Syria. He wants to take some of that territory, push the Kurds out. To be clear, officially, they just want to push the Kurds out, right? They just don't want to have to deal with ongoing Kurdish terrorism as they see it, really Kurdish separatism, that kind of thing. And backed by the United States for a time there until we turned our back on the Kurds. But also practically, maybe technically he's not saying he wants to take over Syria, but the whole Neo-Ottoman Empire conversation that we were having for a little while there, that Turkey has these ambitions to grow in the region and to use the Ottoman Empire as a centerpiece in its historical reconfiguration, looking back at the glory of the Ottoman Empire, reinstantiating that into the modern Turkish public and growing imperially, that kind of thing. That would involve taking over some territory. Now, whether that's annexing it outright or more likely such a degree of influence and control that you don't need to annex it, it's effectively just a proxy state. That's implied as well, I think. Any comments there, Jamarl?
No, I agree with you. I think he wants to expand. And of course, that expansion is a little bit easier when there are less people in the area where he needs to deal with and grapple with. I hadn't heard the story of Erdogan, but yeah, here it is. Turkey wants the U.S. to withdraw troops from Syria and Iraq, similar to how it pulled out of Afghanistan.
I sent it to you yesterday. I posted it in the group chat.
Oh, did you? Oh,
Not
okay.
too much behind the scenes. I did though. We have Brave calling in from ATL from Atlanta, talking about the tech industry, social media, also Facebook. Brave, you're on the line. What's on your mind, man?
Hey, what's going on, guys? Going back to the conversation you guys were having at the head of the show, actually, the first hour, I think it was, you guys were talking about social media and the effect that it's having on people. I think it was specifically about Instagram.
I think that was the second hour. We're talking about that with Peter Coffin, by the way, just now advertising the show. 7:30 this morning, we had a great conversation with Peter Coffin where we started out. We talked about a bunch of stuff, but it really revolved around Facebook and its decisions to... the decision by Zuckerberg to advertise Facebook to users of Facebook, basically putting up pro-Facebook articles on their own news service. Anyway, Brave, I just wanted to set that context up for people. Where were you going with it?
Yeah. It's a no-brainer. I'm just kind of like preaching to the choir, I guess. But it seems like Jamarl made the point that he was talking. You guys were talking, having that conversation. He made the point about, well, what about the buff guys? The athletes? Haven't they always been around? And that's a very key point because yeah, they have. And so I was agreeing with him on that. The thing is that it's not that, and I guess you guys kind of alluded to this. It's not that the terrain has changed. It's that we have changed. Social media has changed us. I often talk about this with Brennan we talk about like Jaron Lanier and what he talked about, saying how social media has just basically ruined our life, also the way we think, also the way we interact and stuff. And I don't know to me, like, you guys have a lot of great conversations today, and they're all kind of interwoven with one throughput, and it all comes back down to media and how they manipulate the way we act, interact, and also what we take in and what we know, right? And obviously that's a no-brainer, right? So the question seems to always come back around to, what do we do about media, right? And I think the only thing that we can do is to, either burn it down or get off of it, or find more self-confidence within ourselves, because we reach this point where we feel like we have to control what everybody thinks, or we have to do something to save everybody from what somebody else thinks. And I think that's the key thing that's changed. Maybe because there was a time before social media where I didn't need to walk into a gym like Planet Fitness and have them protect me from someone who was in better shape than me wearing an outfit that showed their muscles. I could just walk into that gym, and if I'm fat at that time, I go work out because the person makes me want to do better, right? But we're in this place now where we all have to be protected from the other person's thought or from scrutiny. And I think those who are in control of our media, they use that tangent of that little bit of trying to provide safety, right, to manipulate us on.
Let me ask you this. Do you think it's because, like, when you're looking at Sports Illustrated or one of the fitness magazines, those people are so far away from you? It's like those guys are celebs. They're stars. So it doesn't feel like they're tethered to you in any way. It's almost like, okay, well, they're rich. They can buy their trainers. Fair enough. They're somehow different. But when you're dealing with, let's say, like a cousin, an uncle, a friend of yours at work, and you're looking at their life, the comparison is a little different. That person is much more relatable to you. That person is much closer to you. In which case, in some people, I guess whatever the percentage is, creates a certain consternation that wasn't necessarily there when you were looking at a Sports Illustrated or somebody else that seemed to be far more removed. What are your thoughts?
I think that's dead on because a part of it is that here in just in society in general, but in America, like, we push that celebrity. So we put it on a pedestal, and that is important. Like, like the old, I think it was like an old Jay-Z album or something like that, where I can't remember who it was, but the guy had his tape and he put it in for it was like a skit. The guy had his tape, he put it in for his girlfriend to listen to his demo. She didn't want to hear that crap. She wanted to hear it was on the radio. It was basically, right? And that's exactly what you're saying. Like, the celebrity is important. I could be saying the very same thing, and I'm pretty sure you guys experience, especially you, Jamal, because you're married. So we can see our islands. Like, you might be like railing against something, and your wife's like, shut up, like, enough of this, right? But if somebody of importance who's in the public eye says the exact same thing, it's the most important thing. And I think we've all just become a victim to it, and it's ramped up so much that we just seem to lend so much importance to that or that beautiful thing that's put in front of us that we lose our sense of self-importance, or maybe. I don't know.
Well, maybe. I got a couple things here. Andy Warhol mentioned, he had the bit about 15 minutes of fame and how everybody in the future would have it. Well, I don't think he predicted that people would also have their 15 years of infamy, where for years after they say something ridiculous. And this is, people become celebrities based on simply saying egregious things in their past. But also, it's interesting to note which celebrities who said egregious things in their past don't get called out for it, because plenty of people have. And the ones who stick to the narrative, whatever the narrative is at any given time, are usually immune from that level of scrutiny. But one other brief comment here, Brave, and this is, I think, a useful reminder with this stuff. I'm going to get philosophical for just a second. We don't have enough time for it, really, but briefly. Socrates, the first major philosopher in Greece, there were the pre-Socratics who were all talking about like how the world works, and Socrates sort of brought the level of that level of inquiry to the city, talking about politics and psychology and what's true and what's real. What's interesting is we know Socrates through Plato, who wrote all of his stuff up basically. Any sophomore in philosophy knows everything I've said so far completely. Interesting thing about this was right when writing was arriving in Athens and in, throughout the different Greek colonies. as a thing. This was the transition from spoken word to the written word. And you'll read in these dialogues with Socrates describing all the threats of going into writing, how you're going to lose your memory, how it's going to seriously affect you. And I would argue a lot of those things are absolutely true, but we accommodated, and you know where I'm going. Maybe we'll come to accommodate these social media apps too. Maybe it'll become a part of us and it will remove, it'll weaken us in some ways, but strengthen us in others. And I'm left asking the same question that I would about writing. Are we just going to accept it? Practically, what are we left to do? Because I think we're going to, right? So what is that going to look like? How can we make that transition best? And how can you individually, make the right choices so that you don't just succumb to those algorithmic influences? I don't know. These are questions for another time. We're out of time. Brave, thank you for the call. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this morning's show, folks. We're signing off. We'll be back 7 a.m. Eastern tomorrow. Have a great day. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. See you on the other side.